gets it live streaming, we'll move it up to this one and then because you're a board.
Oh, here.
Here? You might see better back.
As soon as we get the signal up, we'll go ahead and get the meeting started.
Yeah.
Can we just?
There's lots of stuff to go over. Yeah. There's also stuff.
Okay. We're a small municipality, we make it work.
So let me know when we're recording and whatever, and we'll get the meeting started.
Okay, and as opposed to roll call, I was just gonna have you guys sound off that you're in attendance.
That sounds good. It's coming up.
How many shows are here?
Coming up.
There.
Right up here, you two. We are down to one monitor for some reason, so, and I got a seat for you up here. Trustee elect Brunner. And Suzanne, if you want to pull a chair up back there, we're just down to the one.
We put it on the wall instead and just.
No, projectors.
That way.
It's not, the projector's not working.
Oh.
And we've been trying to get phones to call us back and.
That would feel good.
I'm just gonna cry. I can't finish that. I'm tall, but I'm not that tall. Sorry, guys.
Well, we're getting settled. I'll pass the swag bag around if you'd like something.
Oh my goodness.
When it says the logo on it, grab something and pass that down if you'd like something. Golf tees and a little dog bowl and pen or whatever you want. It's got CIRSA's logo on it.
Sorry, guys. I'll take a look at the swag bag.
Phoenix?
How we like,
I got what I wanted. Was it dry, please?
what else is in here?
Oh, maybe you can mix and golf tees and.
Yay.
Problem, we were waiting for trustees.
Well, don't go. You want a apple?
No, I have one already. Thank you. It's nice. You can holler if you need to.
I will just take it.
You made it.
Left 2 hours ago. You're 51 minutes.
Oh. Having technical issues.
That's good. I'm Sam. I am a poacher.
Oh,
So I can be.
I get what you meant.
First was David. Sam's was
What's something in there? Do you need a little?
I think I brought pizza crumbs.
Oh, just looking around.
All right, I'm gonna give you guys 2 minutes. We're gonna go ahead and get started. It's gonna be a long day. As long as we're broadcasting to YouTube.
We are, but they have slides.
Yeah, well, slides the same as the handout. Are the slides the same as the handout, Sam? Yeah. All right, well, I'm gonna call this meeting to order. Roll call, we're just gonna go around and say our names.
Sam, are you ready?
Yeah, go ahead. It's
Okay. Trustee McInnes.
Trustee Schwartz,
Trustee Allen.
Trustee Smith. And Mayor-elect. Mayor-elect Smith. Smith. Mayor Bear.
Mayor Pro Tem Knudsen.
Trustee Stelter.
Trustee-elect Walter Checks.
Commissioner Watson.
I'm in public.
Cool. General public. Trustee-elect Brunner.
All right, I'm gonna hand the meeting over to Sam and Dina. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll start. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, trustees, Mayor-elect, trustee-elect, staff for having me out. Good to see you all. It's a wonderful opportunity to come over and visit you all here. By way of introduction, my name is Sam Light, and I'm Deputy Executive Director and General Counsel for CIRSA. And I know we have a mix of some incumbents, some newly elected. How many of you have attended one of my trainings before? Okay. CIRSA stands, for the new folks, CIRSA stands for the Colorado Intergovernmental Risk Sharing Agency. It's kind of a mouthful, right? So we just call it CIRSA. So we're the property and casualty and workers' compensation insurance provider for the town. I'll talk more about CIRSA in a minute, but one of the things we like to do is get out and visit our members. And it's always nice to come back this way. I started my legal career over on the West Slope way back when I was town attorney for Marble and was a water attorney. I think I even did some work for you all on your water portfolio way back in the day. So it's wonderful to come back and visit you all. So that's the reason for my visit. I think you had an election recently, right? So we've got some new folks. And so our executive director, Tammy Tenoy, and I, what we do after the elections is we get out and for our members that want it, we do some orientation training. And then for those who are midterm or have been on the board for a while, it's kind of a refresher, right? To collectively talk about best practices around risk management. So maybe we'll get the slides up on the screen. If not, I know you've got a copy of the slides. And I also put at your places a couple of things. There's some handouts there that I'll mention as we go through the material. And then there's a copy for the newer folks. If you're already on the board, you already have one of these. But if you tell me you lost it, I've got a couple of extras. Or maybe you loaned it to someone or something like that, right? Of our ethics, liability, best practices handbook, which is a handbook that we wrote that talks about risk issues at the governing body level. So I hope that's helpful to you. The folks at Membership Services asked me to remind you, and I've got a couple extra copies of this. Tucked inside the front cover is a little flyer. We actually have a YouTube channel. That's kind of cool. And I'm not sure if I was voluntold or got conscripted in this, but we did on this little sheet there's a QR code that links to some videos that we just put up online. What I'm going to talk about tonight are some serious liability topics, and talk about risks of being an elected or appointed official, but it's not all doom and gloom. We try to put a little light touch on things every now and then. So this QR code will take you to a collection of videos that we put up that have kind of a humorous take, I hope, on some of the topics that we're going to talk about. We even had a comedian help me out because I wasn't the funny guy in the room, but we had a comedian kind of help put those videos together. So I hope you find those to be fun. They're about 3 or 4 minutes each. Okay. So a little bit more about CIRSA. Particularly for the new folks, we're not a commercial insurance provider. We're what's called a Colorado public entity self-insurance pool. So we are not organized for a profit like a commercial insurance carrier. We're organized under Colorado state law, and our only insureds, our only book of business is insuring Colorado cities and towns and affiliated entities. And we're very proud of that. We also think that helps put us close to our members, right? We are member owned. Our board of directors consists of municipal representatives from around the state. And we're very proud of the fact that we think that gives us a close relationship with our members in understanding what your risk and insurance needs are, right? We deal with what I call the bread and butter stuff. We get the policies in place, the renewals in place, the certificates of insurance. On the second floor of our building, we've got this outfit called the claims department, right? Which deals with the claims, but we also have resources for everybody throughout the organization, whether at the elected level or if you're in public works and operations, we have risk management and safety trainings for those folks as well. So you can learn more about us at www.cirsa.org. To give you a sense of our size, we've got 287 members now. We insure about 90% of the municipalities in the state of Colorado. That's virtually all of the mid-sized municipalities in the states, almost all of the mid-sized to mid-larger sized cities, but not the real big ones, the ones like the Denvers and the Colorado Springs. They're a little too big for pooling. They kind of be the tail wagging the dog, right? So we don't insure them, but we insure about 90% of the municipalities around the state. To give you a sense of that longstanding relationship that we value with our members and appreciate so much. Town of Paonia joined CIRSA, our property and casualty program, in 1986. And he joined our workers' compensation program in 1988. So thank you very, very much for being a longstanding member of CIRSA. We greatly value, can't understate how much, overstate how much we appreciate our relationship with you and serving your needs. And we always like to hear from our members. If there are things that you think that we can help you with as an insurance provider that we're not providing, we'd love to hear those suggestions. If you have any concerns about the things that we're doing, we'd like to hear that as well, because we are a membership services organization at the end of the day. Okay? All right, let's talk about what we're going to do. And I'm going to flip, I'll try to remember to tell you what slide I'm on. So if you want to follow along that way, we can do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of being a public official and liability, that idea about how everyone within a municipal corporation has a job description, right? And need to honor and respect that to make sure we're managing risk properly. We'll talk a little bit about transparency. I'm not going to do too much of a deep dive, but I'll just hit on a couple of core issues and then ask if you got any questions around transparency, things like open meetings, open records. Talk about code of ethics, right? Once you became elected, you became subject to Colorado's standards of conduct for elected officials. So we'll talk about what that means. Then we're going to talk about this mysterious thing called the job of being a quasi-judge. That interesting power that you have, right? Decisions that affect people's property rights, like zoning, subdivision, right? Variances. You handle the liquor licenses. If I remember correctly, do you have marijuana licensing? The board decides those as well? Yeah, well, all those decisions involve people's property rights, and we're going to talk about what that means and how there are some different rules that apply to how you approach those decisions. And you need to commit to follow those to stay out of trouble. Those of you who heard me speak before, you know I have a standard disclaimer, which is, I want to make the time as useful to you all as possible. So if you have questions, feel free to interrupt and ask questions. But I do have a good radar for what I call the live one. Okay, so go ahead and ask me anything, and I'm happy to give you thoughts from CIRSA's risk management perspective. But sometimes, you know how it goes. The question is, yeah, Sam, I've got a question. What if another member of the city council does this? And everyone's eyes open wide, oh, this is going to be exciting. My radar is going off telling me that's the burning issue of the day. And if that's something that you got going on, I'll recognize that. And I'll remind you, although I am an attorney, this is not an attorney-client advice. This is a training resource only. So if you need legal advice in the here and now for something, that's for the town attorney, okay? And their team. Same thing with things that are in the town administrator's wheelhouse. Is for Stefan and his team recognize that he's there to support you all. I know we did introductions, but just so I've got a good handle. So we've got incumbent trustees, mayors, okay, and then elected to be soon to take the oath of office, a couple. Do we have some appointed officials here? And you're on which board or commission?
The planning commission.
Planning commission, okay. And then some members of the public as well. So for the planning commission folks, a lot of my presentation is geared towards elected officials, but the same concepts, right, translate through other appointed boards and commissions. There might be a couple things that are only in the board arena that I'll talk about, but I hope this is helpful to you as well. Okay. So I've organized my training around what I call, I guess, suggestions or commitments for best practices, kind of things that if you commit to these best practices around risk management and good governance, then, by and large, I think life risk issues and friction will take care of itself and you'll be in a good spot. So my first, I almost walked past my first handout without even saying what it was. Before I get too far afield of that, one of the first handouts in the stack was CIRSA at a glance. And that little 2-page handout there gives you a little bit more information about who we are and what we do in terms of resources for our members. So I hope that's a nice snapshot for you all. Okay. So I've organized my presentation around what I call suggestions or commitments for good governance and avoiding risk. And so my first one here, it might not sound like much of a risk management suggestion, but it really is. And that's the incumbents get this, but it's good to refresh on these issues, right? Commit to the role of being a public official. Who agrees with this notion? When you become an elected or appointed official, your role and your relationship to the community changes significantly, right? Yeah, you're no longer just a citizen of Paonia, you're now a government official. And I'm here to tell you from a certain perspective, that's a 24/7 job. Doesn't mean don't have a personal life, please do, and please enjoy it, right? But recognize that in the eyes of the citizens, in the eyes of your constituents, right? They will always perceive you to be a representative of the board or the commission, right? They will always perceive you to be a representative of this organization, right? And that's true in any context. It might be primarily with respect to town business, but that's not everything, right? Do you all on occasion interact with citizens? Really? Probably, right? Yeah. And so you know how it goes. You're going to bump into a citizen and they're going to, if you're on the board and they say, well, when's the board going to do something about this? Right? And you're thinking, well, I don't know. We haven't talked about it yet. Right? And so your radar is going off. But the citizen says, well, I know the board hasn't talked about it yet, but so I get maybe the board doesn't have a position, but what's your view as a trustee? And what's your view? And okay, I'll take the bait on that, right? You tell them, well, the board, we haven't formulated a board position or policy on this issue, but this is my personal opinion. This is my personal opinion. This is my personal opinion. What are they filtering? Trustee. That hat is always on from that perspective, right? And as they should, our words, our deeds, our conduct matters, right? Leaves an impression. If we're making decisions that affect people's livelihoods or business or property or quality of life issues, has an effect, right? If we have an interaction with a citizen that doesn't go down the way they thought it should, that might leave a residue with them as well, right? And in a real bad situation, it might even give rise to liability risk. So recognize that that hat of government official is not one that can be easily taken off. And that's a good thing, because we'll step up to the challenge of public service on behalf of our communities, right? But we just need to recognize that there is that perception 24/7 that we are representatives of the organization. Recognize also you're no longer outsiders to town government, all right? Once you take that oath, right, you're now one of the ultimate insiders. And from a risk management perspective, it has this very important switch in the dynamic. When you are on the inside, by the way, for the new trustees, when are we swearing in next week? Is that right?
23rd.
Tuesday. Okay. It used to be back in the day when I was a town attorney, just before you got sworn in, they give you this huge book, the book of ordinances, like hundreds of pages, right? It was like quite a doorstop, right? I don't think they do that anymore, right? Because it's all still there. It's all online. Those rules, those hundreds of pages, they set the rules of the road for how we make decisions procedurally and substantively. And when we're on the inside, right, we don't have the luxury of taking an outsider's view and saying, oh, I don't like that rule, I'm not going to follow it. But that board standard of conduct, I didn't have a hand in adopting that, so I don't need to follow it. Not true. Right? On the inside part of the fiduciary and legal obligation is we're duty bound to follow the rules that apply to how we do our business, both substantively and procedurally. That doesn't mean, that times will come up when you question a rule and you may want to change it, right? But the board collectively has to do that through the legislative process. You don't want to be changing rules on the fly. Recognize now that once you're in office, you're kind of at that top of the organizational pyramid as representatives and ambassadors of the organization, but in a legal sense, you're fiduciaries. You know what that legal term means, right? It's the obligation to put the interest of the entity that I serve as a fiduciary above all other interests, above personal interests, sometimes above the interest of the small but minority. And sometimes that's not an easy job, right?
Yeah, you mind if I interrupt for a second? This is shot, so the hub is toast. Our IT guys will be out either tomorrow or Thursday replacing it. All days, sorry. I think they did try to go directly to it, it wasn't displaying correctly.
Yeah.
So this is what we got. I have to get on the road, so if you need to meet with me individually, I'm happy to access it. Thank you for being here.
Safe travels.
Thank you. I hope this will show.
So that job, right, that being a fiduciary, sometimes that's not easy, right? Knock on wood, probably not every meeting, but some meetings you're gonna have an issue on the agenda where emotions are running high, it's a controversial issue, right? You're getting a lot of input, and maybe during public comment, the first person during public comment says, "Well, you gotta do this, you gotta do it tonight." And the next person stands up and says exactly the opposite. You know, "Board, you gotta do the opposite of that," right? From where you sit as a fiduciary, one of the powers that you have, one of the prerogatives that you have, that I do think translates to risk management, is take the time that you need and get the information that you need that you think will help you, right? Make decisions that serve that fiduciary interest. Right? You know how it goes in that moment, you know, maybe one of those issues comes up during public comment and you're thinking, well, I've not heard of this issue before, right? And it might be frustrating to people who are there, who are thinking maybe you'll take this issue up that evening and make a decision. But if you're feeling like, you know, I need more information from staff, maybe Stefan and the team needs to remind us what options we have and whether we have resources. And maybe the town attorney needs to give us feedback on whether this is something that we even have authority to get involved in, right? So in terms of, you know, serving that fiduciary interest, I think it's your prerogative to slow things down if you need to. Yes, there are some decisions that have deadlines, right? But in general, particularly if it relates to legislative policy, right? If you feel something's not right or you need to deliberate more together as trustees in a public meeting before you make your decision, use that to your advantage. It is true, not for many of our claims, but some of our claims arise out of decisions that are made in haste or that are made on a reactionary basis without good information. So do, you know, be selfish about taking the time you need and getting the information that you need to make good decisions. Okay, this is true for everybody. I'm on page, first, do I have page numbers? I do, page 4, on slide 4. I think this is true for everybody in a municipal organization because we're public-facing entities. And for the elected and appointed officials, part of the job, part of the role is delivering good governance, right? Practicing good governance that helps build faith and trust in you all as trustees and builds faith and trust in the board as an institution. I think in all the years that I've been doing trainings, I've sort of come to the conclusion that, right, committing to good governance and managing risk is really about committing to some core civics principles. Yeah, there's a lot of legal complexity underneath these things, but if we commit to a couple of core civics principles, there's more than what I've mentioned on the slide, but if we commit to these kinds of things, then I think by and large related risk issues will take care of themselves. Okay, so we can break some of those down. But before I do that, let me ask this. Well, the new folks haven't even taken the oath yet, but so we'll ask it as a going in question. But for the incumbent, for everybody, do you like process? Do you like process? Yeah, right? Yes, right? Recognize that one of the products that you provide at the local government level is process. Think about it. You provide a venue and forum, this room, for people to come and talk to you about the needs and wants of the community, right? And then at the, or where you are in the organizational chart, you're uniquely positioned to help decide how we put governmental resources on those needs and wants, but it's a process. Respect and embrace process irrespective of outcome, right? Even if you end up being on the minority side of a 4-3 vote, embrace good process. You want your citizens to leave a difficult decision-making process with the thought that, they may even say, well, I still disagree with what they decided, but I feel like it was a good process. And I feel like I was heard and I feel like I was respected. That's an awesome place to be in terms of building faith and trust in the board as an institution, right? And in turn, minimizing risk. So embrace process as a product itself. Consider issues on their merits alone, right? And that'll serve you well. All right, some of these civics principles include things like commit to openness and transparency, and we'll have few, if any, disputes, lawsuits, claims centering on compliance with Colorado open meetings and open records laws. For the new folks, for who will this be their first time in as a public official? Anyone? Okay, so we all already know, right? That being in public office, the transparency expectations and transparency rules are completely different than the public sector. And we must commit not only the letter of the law, but the spirit. Commit to the spirit of these laws too. I think that helps put you in a good place. Commit to fundamental fairness, and you'll have few, if any, situations where someone's claiming you violated my due process rights. From where you sit on the board or on the planning commission, this risk doesn't present itself all that often. You go, well, why is that? Because staff behind the scenes is taking care of the procedural prerequisites to a good public hearing. You know, they're there making sure that notice is properly given, that the packet's properly assembled, that kind of thing. But it does present itself every once in a while. Maybe during a public hearing, the mayor or the planning commission chair opens the hearing. Somebody stands up during public comment and says, before you start this hearing, I object to this hearing of due process objection. I object because I didn't get notice. Which I always thought was kind of weird because they're standing right there, right? So they must have found out somehow, right? But that's kind of the softball. But what if they're saying something like, you know, I object to this proceeding because I believe that certain members have bias and can't participate in the hearing, right? Or I believe that the legal notice was improper, that there were documents that should have been in the packet that aren't there. What we want you to do at CIRSA and manage that risk as the elected, so the planning commission, is at that point in time, we want you to slow it down. And on the record of the hearing, we want you to make a record of how you handled that procedural objection. Now, it may be that everything's fine, but you just still need to, you know, the mayor might ask the clerk or the staff member, do we have proper notice? All right, let's confirm that. Let's, you know, get it all out there on the record. If it turns out we don't have good notice, then, you know, we need to take a break and continue this to a future meeting or carry it over so we fix those problems. But as long as we make a good record of how the objection was handled, then you're in a good place. You don't, process problems don't get better by ignoring them. Right, we got to take those on head on. Okay. Commit yourself to being predictable and even-handed. You got all those rules that apply. Right, it sounds like the boring part of being a government official, but that's good. You know, your citizens kind of appreciate the boring aspect of this. They probably all do, but the business community in general, right, expects that you will apply your rules on a predictable and even-handed basis. Right? If someone comes in front of the board with a request, right, they may have the attitude, well, you know, I submitted my request to the staff and I put it in front of the board, and what was expected of me was understood. I knew what materials and information I had to give. I knew what the standards were going to be for the decision, and the board discussion was very straightforward, and I got my approval, no problem. That's great. You don't want somebody who's feels like they're in the same position thinking, well, that's odd, you know, because I have the same type of application or request, but, you know, I felt like they were asking me for things that I didn't think were required as part of the application process. There were some strange things going on during the discussion at the meeting. And most concerningly, lo and behold, on the night the board decided my request, that's the time and the first time that the board took some novel and unprecedented interpretation of its own standards, and they turned me down. Not a great place to be. The actual legal risk there is equal protection. There's a fancy word on the slide called certiorari. That's the vehicle for making a legal challenge that basically says a governmental body that was bound by law to make a decision according to certain criteria threw the criteria out the window. And their decision was based on arbitrary standards. They made up the reasons for approval of denial, and it had nothing to do with the actual standards that they were supposed to follow in making the decision. Not a good place to be from a legal perspective. Those are easy challenges for someone who wants to overturn your decision. Then lastly, the last bullet, mutuality of respect may not sound like a risk management perspective, but we do have claims that are boring, you know, the kernel of why that person's pursuing their claims. They do feel like they were respected. So commit to mutual respect with each other, as fellow elected officials, with staff, with citizens that you interact with, in terms of how you interact with each other. You know, your meetings, your deliberations, your discussions always ought to feel like it's a safe space where everyone has equal time to express their opinion on the issue under consideration, no matter how different than anyone else's view, right? And that we're actively listening, even if it's not our favorite issue. The fascinating thing about being a local government official is you deal with so many different subject matters, right? And what may interest you most is water, or maybe land use, or maybe taxation, right? But we want to be an active participant with respect to all those issues, and make sure we're engaged in the decision-making process. Any thoughts, questions on that before I pivot a little bit? Yes.
Say it for me again, Saratori?
Certiorari.
So that's to do with following your own rules.
Right.
Is this a place for you to speak at all about what happens if staff fails to follow the rules as they bring things towards you?
Well, we can talk a little bit about it. It'll depend on the job of the legislator, the governing body, right? With respect to administrative matters, we set the parameters. Sometimes they call them executive limitations. That's what consulting gurus call them. But by legislation, you're setting a policy and rules, and then staff is obligated to follow those, right? Now, if you as an elected official believe that the rules aren't being followed, where do you go with your concern? Where do you go?
Town administrator.
Where else?
Mayor.
My suggestion, mayor, town attorney, town administrator, right? But if the concern is with somebody in public works, in operations, do you go there? No, your point of contact, your relationship to the administrative service of the organization should be the town administrator, or the mayor, or the attorney. And we'll get into in a couple of minutes why that's so. Right, you want to use that single point of accountability and contact as your resource and support, but there's an intentional risk management principle behind that, right? It protects you from some liability. We'll talk more about it in a minute. Okay, is that helpful? Now, on the other hand, there may be a dynamic where the rules are unclear. And my 25 years as a municipal attorney, like things would get in front of the elected governing body and there'd be confusion about what the rules meant. Right? You don't want that to devolve into staff you're not following the rules, because if the lack of clarity is in the ordinance, how do we get that fixed? You all help it. So we want to mutually support each other if there's confusion about what rules apply and whether people are following the rules. And you want to make sure that staff feels safe and supported in bringing forward a concern like, oh, the purchasing policies, we keep saying that the purchasing policies aren't being followed. Is the root of this problem that there's some lack of clarity in the purchasing policy where we as staff need to bring you a recommendation, then you need to tell us. And we're fine with whatever you tell us. You can tell us X, Y, or Z, and we'll follow X, Y, and Z, but we need to tackle the problem together. Is that helpful?
So,
yeah, okay. But there's stuff with more hair and warts on it. Okay, do we need to talk more about that, or should my radar be going on? Okay. Yeah, I mean, the staff is, intentionally violating some rule, then the question becomes, who do I go to with that? You talk to the administrator. It's the administrator's responsibility, working with the department head, right, to look into the matter and figure out what's going on, right? But they're going to only involve you on a need-to-know basis, if at all. Talk about why in a minute. Okay. Yeah. That's a good segue into this. For the folks who haven't taken the oath yet, I hope your first question to the town attorney will not be this: can I get sued in this job? And the answer is, yeah, there's a risk of potential liability as an elected official, even the risk of personal individual liability, right? So it's important that in order to manage that risk properly, that everyone in the organization, right, recognize and honor their role, their job description within the organization, okay? For the new folks in particular, but as a refresher for everyone, I'm just going to, again, remind you what the protections are. That's a good thing. And we want them. In Colorado, we have nice, strong protections for elected and appointed officials. We want those so that people are willing to volunteer to serve their communities, but there are some limitations. So first, the protections. Under Colorado, what I'm talking about here is whether someone can sue you and hold you individually and personally liable as a trustee for something that you do or don't do as a trustee. In Colorado, we have a statute called the Colorado Governmental Immunity Act. Basically says this: the town, and by extension, the town's insurance company, CIRSA, will defend you and will pay judgments entered against you for acts or omissions as a trustee. Good news. Protected. Like all things in life, there's a catch, right? There's some limits on that. Those protections apply only so long as you are acting within the scope of your employment and not acting in a willful and wanton manner. Scope of employment probably sounds odd to an elected or appointed official, right? My takeaway for you all is don't worry about the language. Scope of employment simply means authority for job description. It means one must stay within their job description, right? Only exercise the authority that they do have. So that's the takeaway. It's the actual phrase that's used in the statute. Give you a real simple example of that. Within the town of Paonia, within whose scope of employment, within whose job description, is it to decide whether or not someone gets their building project red tag because it's not in compliance with the building code? Within whose SOE is that? Town administrator, again, your code, you probably call it the chief building official.
Building inspector, yeah.
Yeah, so in whose scope of employment ain't it? Within whose scope of employment isn't it? Ain't it? Not only you, everybody else. Yeah, you know, the finance director, not their, it's not their SOE, right? Town clerk, not their SOE if it's the job of the building official, right? Within whose scope of employment, within whose job description, right, is it to decide whether or not a person gets a ticket into municipal court? Do you have a municipal court? Right?
Yes.
Police. Within whose scope of employment ain't it? Everybody else, we all intuitively get this, right? But I will tell you, we have claims every once in a while where the plaintiff says, like maybe they get their building permit red tag. And in my way of looking at the world, when they get that claim, it's like, oh, okay, well, it was the decision was by the chief building official. That's who has authority under the code. So if we get a claim, the proper party, if they disagree with that building official decision, the defendants ought to be the building official in their official capacity and the town, right? Sometimes the claimants start adding other people. Sometimes they add them even individually. And when our defense attorneys call up that claimant attorney, they go, what are you doing naming elected or appointed officials in here? Right? And the claims attorney says, well, I've read your ordinance and your org chart, and I know who's supposed to make the decision. But my allegation, right, is that there were elected or appointed officials behind the scenes directing that my client's building permit be revoked, right, or something like that, or interfering with their rights. So you don't want to purport to exercise authority you don't have. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. So any thoughts, questions on that? It runs all directions. Within whose scope of employment, within whose job description is it to decide whether or not this town has some quality of life ordinance? I don't know, maybe a short-term rental ordinance. That's kind of a hot topic. Within whose job description is that? The board. And only the board, right? Staff could give you a recommendation that says, we really think you want to adopt this ordinance. If you decide we don't want to adopt it, that's your scope of employment. Right? Within whose scope of employment is to decide whether or not the town incurs debt. Either you or the citizens buy it, right? Yeah, but not anybody else, right? So it permeates the organization. All right, the other interesting phrase there is you're protected as long as you're not engaging in willful and wanton conduct, which is just a fancy phrase. So that phrase and certiorari, that phrase, I think it paid way too much law school tuition. Willful and wanton is just this. It's conduct that's intentionally undertaken, that's designed to injure someone's legal rights and taken with reckless disregard for what their rights are. And I got an even simpler way of describing it. I just call it bad stuff. That's what it is. Bad stuff. Bad stuff. I talk to my claims people. We don't get, knock on wood again, many claims each year where someone alleges that an elected or appointed official or employee, same concept applies to public employees, engaged in willful and wanton conduct. But it's always this type of situation. It's almost always an individual elected or appointed official misperceiving that they have some governmental authority that they actually don't have, right? Throwing on that purported cloak of governmental authority and doing bad things to people for the wrong reasons. And it really would be bad stuff. It'd be like, going on and maybe conscripting, in my earlier example, conscripting the building official and going on a campaign to make sure that your business competitor didn't get their building permit or got revoked, or going after a political enemy for no good reason, or intentionally defaming people when you know the things you're saying are false, right? And you're purporting to do that as a government official. Malicious acts, of course, criminal acts, purporting, to wear some cloak of governmental authority, engage in a criminal act, obviously is way beyond the pale. So we all know where the outer boundaries are, and we're going to stay far away from them. But I need to tell you that that's where the outer boundary is. We do get, on occasion, allegations of intentional, willful, and wanton conduct. And if you're actually found to have been engaged in willful and wanton conduct, town's obligation to protect you from that falls away. And in a worst case situation, you can even be found personally liable for punitive damages. Not to sound like the Grim Reaper here, but the concept of willful and wanton is interconnected with your public officials liability insurance. We provide you public officials liability insurance. We protect you against allegations of alleged wrongful acts, alleged civil rights violations. And all those protections neatly fit and attach and provide you defense when we're staying within the scope of our authority and not acting in willful and wanton capacity. There are exclusions to coverage, like we do not pay for the civil liability that flows from criminal acts or from malicious acts or from willful and wanton conduct, okay? So, sorry to sound so dour about that, but it's important to understand the limits on that protection. So I'll end with a silver lining. You know, conversely, don't let the fear of liability drive decision making. If you have a particularly contentious application, for example, but if you know, after you've received staff support and legal advice, if you know you're making the right decision through a fair and defensible process, applying the appropriate legally acceptable criteria, then you're going to be just fine. And don't stray the course because the applicant is saying, or someone else is saying, if you approve or deny this application, I'm going to sue each and every one. I'm going to sue you individually. That's what these protections are there to do. They're there for you, for that kind of thing. And that's what we do on your behalf, okay? All right, I was talking there about state law and federal law. We've all read, particularly the last couple of years, read this concept of qualified immunity, right? At the federal level, you have a similar protection. Does someone have a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just turn that around.
Yeah.
If you ignore your own law and let something happen or not happen because you're afraid you'll be sued, is there a particular liability there? I mean, if that's your stated reason because you're afraid you'll be sued.
You'll be sued for ignoring the law?
Yeah.
If we get close to a live one, I'll tell you, but give me an example because I'm trying to understand.
There was a case at one point in town here where something happened that was a pretty blatant violation of zoning laws, and it was ignored for a long time. And then by the time it finally got to the board, there was a decision made with a public statement that we can't touch this because it's gone so far. We'll have a liability if we try to do something about it now.
Yeah. So that is a kind of some on the radar. You don't want to consult with your attorney, but I'll give you an example. Okay? I'll give you an example. Let's say you fail to follow the budget. Do you have civil liability for that? You failed to adopt a budget by December 15th. Is there personal civil liability for no? No, that's the board's responsibility, right? At best, someone might be able to bring some claim for what we call declaratory judgment, just ask the judge to tell you that you failed to meet your obligation, but it wouldn't be a path to individual personal liability for money damages, okay? Conversely, if someone stands up during public comment, what do you get, 3 minutes for public comment? And what's the limitation on what I can say during public comment?
You have to be nice and you have to be fair.
Nice and fair, that's fantastic. That's our aspirational goal and we love that. But Sam, and here I am, Citizen Sam, I'm one who kind of read that and I kind of winked at it. 30 seconds into it, you know how this goes. Like, you're all crooks and liars and I'm defaming you and you don't like what I'm saying. And then one of you says, I make a motion that we have Mr. Light removed from the room. Officers, please escort him out of the room. Is there a path there for potential individual personal civil liability for money damages? Why? Because that may be a civil rights violation, right? We don't want to attempt to quash citizen speech because of the content or viewpoint of what they're expressing. There are some limits on that, right? Like, is there inciting a riot or engaging in sexually explicit obscene speech? We can shut that down, right? But we can't remove a person from, if the law is well established, right? And we can't remove a person forcibly from the room solely because of the viewpoint that they're expressing, right? That would be a situation where we're charged with what the knowledge of the law is. We chose to ignore it, and now we've got exposure to civil liability. Okay. On longstanding, back when I was a town attorney.
There's another question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
At some point, will you get into talking about how we, best practices for handling public comments?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. When we get to the transparency piece, let's touch on that. Let me tie up the federal piece of it, because I was talking about state law. In federal law, you do have similar protection, but it's the state law protection is sort of like a governmental immunity concept. At the federal level, there's a form of qualified immunity. We read about it in the paper a lot because of police. But the concept of federal qualified immunity applies to all government actors, right? And it basically says this, that you're insulated from individual personal liability for violations of federal law, right? Insofar as your conduct does not violate clearly established federal rights, a reasonable person would have known. The most interesting phrase to me there is, would have known. Would have known. And be selfish about this. This is a fair question from your perspective of, like, how do I know? How do I know, right? So this risk doesn't present itself all that often, but sometimes you get into areas where somebody's saying, hey, you don't have authority to do that, right? Or, hey, you're violating my civil rights, right? In terms of risk management around those issues, what similar to my earlier comments, what we recommend you do is just slow it down. Ask your town attorney, are we on good ground? Give your attorney a little grace when they give you that classic attorney answer that says, it depends, right? Because particularly in the area of federal civil rights liability, it really does depend. I gave you an easy example about First Amendment rights liability, where you with intention and malice, you kick somebody out of a room because you didn't like what they were saying and it was otherwise protected political speech. But there can be stuff that's a lot more debatable. And in that situation, what you want to do, if you're feeling uneasy about that, is just get some advice. Hey, what are our options here? What authority do we have? What are the pros and cons from a legal risk perspective about pursuing this course, that course, and take the time you need to get that help, and that'll help you manage those civil rights risks. Okay. The way it interacts with some of the things that go on is, well, here are some examples. Like in short-term rental regulation, there's a whole debate about whether regulating short-term rentals violates people's rights under the Commerce Clause. That's an evolving area of the law. Hey, if that comes up, ask your town attorney for some analysis around that. Maybe you get an applicant who's actually like a church or a religious land use. And you say to them, well, yeah, we get it. You want to put a religious institution in town, you got to follow the same rules as everybody else. But they say, actually, we don't want to follow that rule. And we think we're allowed to get a pass on that because if you impose that rule upon us, you're going to be interfering with our rights of religious exercise. The answer is, it depends. It depends. Very detailed analysis about what you can and can't do in terms of regulating religious, particularly because they got a dedicated federal statute called the Religious Land Uses and Institutionalized Persons Act that sets up all sorts of laws around this issue. Okay, so particularly in civil rights, the last thing is on civil rights risk. The risk of retaliation can be exacerbated, right, by conduct that suggests that we overreacted or that we did something in retaliation, right? Or somebody exercising their rights that they otherwise have. So be careful about that risk, okay? With your question? I think we wrapped up your question.
Yeah.
All right, sort of all this begs, what's my job description as elected official? What's my SOE, scope of employment, right? So just recognize that Town of Pioneer operates as a statutory town. That means you have the authority given to you under state statutes and the authority that's necessarily implied from those state statutes. Unlike a home rule community, you don't have the ability to go look to your own charter. You don't have a charter that gives you more power in matters of local concern. So you have to comply with state statute. And under state statute, you have chosen to organize as what we call a board administrative form of government, right? Where the board serves as a legislative and governing body. It says that right in the state statute, right? Legislators, governing body, 40,000 foot level. You're analogous to the board of directors of a corporation, right? And your primary responsibilities are things like setting policy, legislating, et cetera. And your town administrator, to quote your code, is your executive and administrative authority, right? Your administrator is the person who is responsible for the administrative day-to-day. So I don't harp on it too much, but there absolutely is, and for risk management purposes, there absolutely is a distinction between the functions of policymaking and legislation, which is your job, right? And the job of administering the organization, serving as the administrator to get the work done on a day-to-day basis. Okay. So look at it on one slide. Slide 8 now.
What's the title of that slide?
Supporting the town structure. And it's got a little on the left-hand side, it's got a little hierarchical.
Yeah, there's several of them.
Yes.
Oh.
See, they're not, our pages are not numbered.
It's on the left-hand side of the slide, it's got the words ownership in blue lettering there.
Okay, there it is. So this one.
So if you look at it in a hierarchical sense, you have to ask yourself, what's our scope of employment? What's my role, job as an elected official? And I would commend to you that as a legislator, right, you're dealing with the ownership and governance issues, right? Deciding the needs and wants of the community with respect to governmental resources. Right? Being a legislative body, the board of directors is responsible for policy setting, big picture stuff, looking forward, right? On your plate ought to be questions like, where do you want this community to be in 3, 5, 10 years? The important documents for you are what? Annual budget, master plan, 3 and 5 year capital plans, water resources planning. It's not the building permit or the personnel action form involving some specific employee. It's that broader stuff that only the board, right, of directors, the legislative body, can handle, right? So you want to spend your time there. I would commend you to be selfish about setting aside the time to work on those big visionary things that only the board is situated to work on. You have the longest time horizon, right? Instead of thinking about day-to-day and reacting to day-to-day stuff, you have the longest time horizon in the organization. You have the broadest interest in mind. And the other thing you want to do is work together as fiduciaries to protect the board as an institution. I would suggest to folks, municipal work, in my way of looking at the world, is kind of like a train, right? We want that train to get to its destination, but, we all get on and off that train during our terms of office. Part of what we want to do is make that engine stronger and help it get to its destination, right? And so I think that suggests us that we ought to do the things as a board working together, to make that institution as a board stronger, leave the board stronger when you leave it than when you found it. That's a good place to be. But in terms of getting back to the actual job descriptions, you're the legislative and governing body, and you delegated the responsibility for administrative matters to staff. Okay, that idea kind of permeates the organization, as my earlier suggestion. Right, there are allocations of responsibility everywhere in the organization. Some jobs belong to the finance director, the clerk, the police, the building official, public works folks. Right. And you want to embrace the fact that you as a board or your predecessors have decided affirmatively to allocate authority and responsibility that way, because it frees up your time to do the work that only the board can do. Okay? So this idea of role discipline, and particularly in terms of risk management, is particularly important in the area of employee relations and administrative matters that have been assigned to staff. I've skipped to the next slide now. I'll turn to the next slide. So you as a board, you have a couple of employees that you supervise, is that right? And the administrator, attorney, judge.
Chief of police.
Administrator's not appointed.
I'm sorry?
Administrator's not appointed.
Contract.
Contract.
But we still supervise him. He is our employee.
I raise an interesting legal question, but I won't go down the rabbit. So you have 3 or 4 employees that you supervise. Right. Yeah, the chief is, I think, appointed by the board upon the recommendation of the administrator, which comes, right? Okay. So recognize and embrace the fact that except for those 4 employees, right, elected and appointed officials are not employee supervisors. I will absolutely assure you that that's a wonderful place to be from a risk management perspective, because on the ballot it said trustee, legislator, member of the governing body. It did not say HR. And the whole risk area around employment practices liability is incredibly complex. Gets more complex each year with each legislative session. And even for the full-time professionals that do HR, it's very hard to keep up with this stuff. Okay, so you want to rely upon the fact that through your personnel policies and your ordinances, you have already allocated to the administrator and supervisors below the administrator the responsibility for supervising, disciplining, giving direction to line staff. Okay, this is enshrined in your standards of conduct, right? A couple of things there. It says no member shall act or attempt to act on any matter which is encompassed within the responsibilities of the administrator or other staff, and no member shall give orders to staff, right? So it doesn't mean we can't be friendly and collegial and say hi, and it doesn't mean that probably step out, and so he'll correct me tomorrow if I'm wrong. It doesn't mean we can't, ask a department head, hey, what's the status of that project? But I think you want to make sure the administrator's in the loop, right? So we don't have communications breaking down. You want to be mutually supportive in communication so you don't end up with like telephone. Into telephone about what's going on. And the easiest way to do that is to use your administrator as your point of contact. Let the administrator chase down the information that you need, right? And that will help you. Also, with regard to approaching individual staff members, again, we could be collegial, but think about it from their perspective. If they're thinking, I've got an individual elected official coming to me with something related to my job. Are they telling me I should be doing something? What if it was different than what their own supervisor told them? Now we're just undermining our own organizational structure that we adopted as a board, right? So we'll be very careful of that, okay? So I'm not naive around this risk. 25 years of doing this, it was not unheard of, Internally, maybe somebody comes to you and says, psst, can I talk to you about my boss? And what's our response? We love and appreciate our employees, but I, as a trustee, and we as a board do not get involved in personnel matters at that level. I encourage you to talk to your supervisor or HR, the manager, and they can help you with that issue. It may come from the outside, maybe a citizen. We got a beef with some employee, right? And they've already gone to the administrator, and the administrator said, I've looked into it, and I'm sorry you're disappointed with your interaction with staff member. We'll make improvements, but here's, sometimes part of public work is you got to deliver a no, even though no matter what, you can never give, maybe a situation, you just can't give the person the answer that they want, right? But sometimes people try and circumvent that by going to whom? A trustee, right? Yeah. So citizen comes to you with a beef about it. What are we going to do with that? We're going to call an administrator and we're going to unburden ourselves of that. And just like we want to be respectful of the administrator's response when they say, what? I got it. I'll take care of it. But you're thinking, but it keeps coming up. Who are you going to have the conversation with? Administrator, right? And your point of contact with the administrative service is the administrator, right? And that's where the accountability is too. So you keep that conversation. We like that from a risk management perspective, because if I have an employment claim and let's say somebody gets terminated, we usually look at the org chart and we say, all right, who's the supervisor head firing authority? Okay, that's the first person we need to interview. Let's figure out why that, So we call the supervisor and say, okay, we got a, wrongful discharge claim. Someone was terminated. Can you explain the reasons for the termination? What if the supervisor said, well, I didn't really want to terminate? Are we off to a good start? Right? Yeah, what if it turns out, some other department heads told me to fire that person, or worse yet, an elected appointed officials directing me to fire that person. That's contrary to your own written word, right? And it's a bad place to be from a risk management perspective from where you sit. I've never had an elected official who we had to interview or have submitted to a deposition in an employment practices case ever come back to me again and say, that was a lot of fun, let's do it again. So there are risks. There's risk of retaliation, right? That can attach to people individually. The reason these structures are set up is to give you a single point of accountability and contact for the administrative service, and on the flip side, to protect you from risks like retaliation risks. So if we embrace and honor that, yeah, it can sometimes feel a little frustrating, but our point of accountability and contact is the administrator. And if we stay away from those issues, don't we don't want to get improperly individually involved, then we'll be protected in that regard. Okay? Now, none of this means the opposite of that. With regard to your direct reports, you do want to, as a board, commit to speak with them in one voice and give them clear direction so you can get accountability. But we know how to look sometimes, right? With the mayor, we have a nice discussion at the board, and the mayor says, okay, that's great. Good discussion. We need to give Stefan some direction. So what's our direction? We go around the dais, we have 7 different ideas of what the direction is. Is that the point when we turn to Stefan and say, you got your direction? You know? But who owns that issue? The board. And you want to, but you got to commit to work it out. The mayor is, among the other dark arts that they practice, is the wisdom to realize that maybe the situation is intractable that evening, or he's looking around the dice, we got 7 different views of what we're going to do here. Okay, well, but let's commit to bring it back at a later meeting. So that we as a board, we can speak with the voice of the board to our direct reports. You want to commit to do that, and I assure you, you'll work it out. It may take more time, and might even have to have a vote on what the direction is, but you commit to that, you're going to make your board stronger, and you're going to get accountability and clarity. You don't want to leave it hanging, because what can happen? I saw it so many times when I was a town attorney. You have that messy discussion, and then a couple of days later, people start swinging by the administrator's office. Right? Oh, that was a messy discussion the other night. But here's what I want you to do. All right? Is that consistent with the voice of we? Right? Would you be surprised or upset if somebody who had the opposite view that you had of what the direction ought to be were doing the same thing? So yeah, I know it can be uncomfortable sometimes, but as a board, that's how we make ourselves individually and a board stronger. You just have to get back together and work through those issues. And that'll serve you well. Okay? So I think I'm flipped over to the next slide where it says the supporting town structure, and the first line says tips to support structure and avoid concerns. And I think we touched on most of these. I just want to hit on a couple more. Recognize that, yes, you do, on an individual basis, do some ambassadorship in the organization, right? But by and large, being a member of a multi-member governing body or planning commission is a we job. We each bring our own individual perspectives, experiences, thoughts, ideas, priorities. But at the end of the day, we're working towards contributing to the voice of the board, the voice of the we. That's the voice that has effect. If you read your code, except for the certain powers that the mayor has, there's nothing in those hundreds of pages that says the powers of the board of trustees may be exercised by one trustee. It's a collective power. So I want to recognize that it's a group role, and your town attorney will tell you that that's a good thing, because when we act together as a we and talk together as a we, there are a lot more liability protections. You can hear it now. It's very hard. Like if you deny a rezoning request, you can, the applicant says, well, I'm so mad about that decision that you all made, but I'm going to sue you and only you. And it's a very difficult path to individual liability when we're working as the we, right? So keep that in mind as well, okay? Let me mention one more thing about this aspect. Do you have board reports during your meeting, or an opportunity for each board member to give kind of updates on what? Sometimes during a meeting, there'll be an informal point where, the presiding officer says, anyone else have anything to report that they want to share with the board? And then I, as a board member, raise my, yes, Mayor, I've got something to report. Since our last board meeting, I did this. Everyone else says, you did what? Right? There may never be a risk of third-party liability, but I think it's a wise governing body that identifies whether there's some concern around that issue. The reason I mention is I want people to be protected, but you ought to have norms of conduct and agreed upon expectations about how you represent the board individually and what you're doing in between meetings, so that when you ever have a meeting and somebody does something like that, there's not surprise. We've actually had legal claims around this issue where somebody went out and did something on their own and the rest of the board was upset about it, and it devolved into a legal fight over whether they should or shouldn't have done that. I think it's a wise board that, thinks about those issues in advance, because you're all super busy. You're already all volunteering your time, more or less, right? Do you get paid? Yeah, so we're already super busy. So if we raise our hand when the board says, well, who would like to go talk to the fire district? Right? Oh, yes, I'll do it. Mayor, I know you can't make it to that meeting, so I'll go. We want that person to feel supported, but it does require the nuanced thing of checking in with each other. Okay, what's the expectation? And that risk can present itself from the outside too. If you go to that meeting, one of you raise your hand. Yes, I'll go as our liaison. I'll go talk to the fire district or some regional task force. And you get to that meeting and you didn't know this was coming. They say, hey, we got to sign this letter to the state today. And we need to know right now, what is the Paonia Board of Trustees position on this issue? Well, if you don't have one yet, you have every right to be selfish about that and say, hey, your emergency is not our emergency. Our board needs to talk about this issue. So that's a risk issue that may not create liability, but is one to keep attuned to. Okay. Last thing with regard to supporting the town structure on the next slide, the one that says commit to personal conduct that strengthens the lead. And in terms of strengthening the board as an institution, sometimes the job does require us to make personal sacrifices. Right? Things like setting aside a personal agenda when there's lack of support. Right? You may say, do you have an STR ordinance, short-term rental ordinance?
We're working
on it. Okay. You may say, I ran for office or I got elected, and my number one issue that all my people want is for us to have an STR ordinance. And we just have to be attuned that, unless I can get 3 members to come along with me, right? And if I can't, I got to be willing to shell that personal agenda, that personal interest in view of and in service of the work plan and priorities of the board as identified by the board. Do you ever have split votes, man? Okay, so, what if you have one of those split votes, it's a 4-3 vote, and you're on the 3 side, is it okay to go back to your people and go, I didn't vote for that one? I'm just the insurance person. So far be it from me, you can tell your people whatever you want to tell them. Right? But they already know how you vote, right? Because it's on the public record. But in terms of strengthening the institution, right, we're all going to win some and lose some. Right? In terms of strengthening the board as an institution, would the message be different if you said, yeah, I didn't vote for that one, but we had a real good discussion as a board. There were a lot of passionate opinions, a lot of different opinions on what we ought to do as a board. I fought like heck for my position, but you know what? The board decided to go a different direction, and I support the decision of the board. That shows your constituents, right, that we as a board, no matter how strong our disagreements are, that when the decision is done, right, we honor that decision and we move on. You don't have to be the main cheerleader, right? But certainly from a risk perspective, you can't do things that affirmatively undermine the decision that was reached by the majority. I'll give you a real life example of that. I did have one of those 4-3 decisions, very controversial land use decision. And the board, the governing body said, by a 4-3 vote, we said, we'll approve your development, but to get us over the hump, we're going to impose one condition. And that is you have to go to the neighbor and get an easement for a secondary access to help address traffic concerns. And the neighbor was even at the meeting and said, well, I'm willing to negotiate, with them about that, no problem. 4-3 vote, one of the people on the 3 side did what afterwards? Went to the neighbor, started trying to convince the neighbor not to grant that easement. Good idea? It's a 24/7 job from that perspective, right? And that applicant that we just told yes is looking at this going, wait a second, you're a member of the governing body that just said that I can pursue this project if I meet that condition. And you can't take off that government official hat that easily. The actual legal risk that we're worried about in terms of liability is whether that person was engaging in tortious interference, right? Because they were a member of the body that just said yes, right? So be attuned to those kind of risks. Recognize, as I talked about it earlier with concepts of allocation of responsibility, recognize that once you're done with the policymaking piece, a lot of governmental work involves, then the policy's been set, we hand off the job to the staff, right? And staff recognizes it the other way, but we have to be careful about dynamics too. Staff knows they shouldn't put a hot potato in your lap just because it's a hot potato, right? If there's some administrative decision, right? Somebody comes in for a building permit and they meet all the code and they're entitled to the building permit and the building official is required to issue that. We're not going to put that in front of the board just because it's a business, that some folks might not like. And conversely, the board's going to be supportive of that building official when they issue a building permit for some controversial business. I don't know what it would be, I don't know, marijuana dispensary or something, right? They may meet all the code and they're entitled to building permit, but sometimes that shows the interesting dynamic between policy and administration. Set the policy and it creates an entitlement, as long as standards are met, then we're mutually supportive that, hey, that's a decision that has to be made and to which an individual is entitled. Okay. Last one, this goes to that internal risk. Sometimes people call me at CIRSA and they say, isn't there a statute or something that addresses this? Because they want to know if there's some magic wand that can alleviate the concerns or friction that's bubbling up internal to a board where people are accusing each other of getting ahead of or speaking for the board before the board has had a chance to articulate its own voice. I get that that's a balance, between our own personal viewpoints, but I think in your board standards of conduct, it even has a nice little sentence in there about, we need to be attuned to not speaking for the board before the board has had a chance to determine what its own voice is. Okay. All right, let's pivot and talk about transparency stuff. I just want to touch on a couple of issues real quick. Particularly for the new folks, as a reminder, so when you become a public official in Colorado, you become subject to the Colorado Open Meetings Law, okay? And there are resources around that issue, but I just want to remind you of the main rule. The Open Meetings Law says that whenever 3 or more members, how many folks are on the planning commission? Okay, same rule. Same rule. Whenever 3 or more members meet to discuss public business, that's a meeting that has to be open to the public. It just simply means a citizen has a right to observe that discussion. Okay? The second important piece is any action by the board has to be taken only in a public meeting for which you've previously published notice and an agenda. Okay? A couple of safe harbors. What if, I forgot to check what the name of the local watering hole is on my way in town, but what if 4 of the trustees decide to go out for a drink, right? Does that have to be an open meeting? What if 4 trustees bump into each other at the coffee shop? No. Yeah, the statute expressly does not apply to social gatherings or chance gatherings so long as discussion of public business does not become the purpose of that gathering. So it's absolutely fine that 4 of you have coffee, but if the clerk just sent out the packet the night before and you bump into each other at the coffee shop, that's not the time to say, hey, did you get the agenda in the packet? Hey, let's talk about that budget amendment that Stefan proposed. And that would be improper because it's not an open to the public. Okay.
Can I ask, what about town issues in general? They might not be on the plate at the moment, but if 4 trustees got together and talked about just general town issues, is that considered a meeting?
Well, if you're a trustee and it's worthy of us talking about it, I've usually found in my 25 years, it probably has something to do with something that's either already here or is soon to arrive. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's probably already within our orbit. So I think the conservative thing is, right? And none of this precludes a one-on-one discussion, right? It's a rule of 3. So we all agree that the openness requirement is triggered when 3 or more members meet to discuss public business. And as municipal attorney, I agree that one-on-one discussion is okay. But what do you think about one-on-one? Yeah, they have all sorts of names for them. Serial meeting, daisy chain meeting. In Texas, they call it a walking quorum. I love working into my presentation. They're walking around getting a quorum. Seems so Texan, right? But here's the deal, right? And I'll just cut to the chase to tell you what the risk is. If the evidence, in a legal challenge, if the evidence suggests that what was done at the open public meeting is a mere rubber stamp of the decisions that were reached by some other method, then that's where you're going to get into trouble. So I don't mean to understand, it is an important part of the job to sit down one-on-one and get to know each other. Talk about philosophies and broad views. And you can do that on a one-on-one basis, but we all intuitively know that's completely different than, you got a controversial vote coming up, calling each other one at a time to figure out how we're going to vote. That's not permissible. Okay? want to make sure you have your deliberations about public policy in this room from the ground floor up. You don't want to leave citizens with a feeling that they're walking into the middle of a conversation. Okay. Let's see, on other transparency issues, somebody want to talk about public comment?
Yeah, I just have a question about public comment and best practices. And what are those? Like, do we respond? Like, it sometimes feels very one-sided when it's just like these things, sometimes accusations, sometimes defamatory, sometimes great questions come at us.
Yeah.
Like, am I just supposed to sit here stoically and nod my head? How do we respond?
Yeah.
Do we respond?
Yeah, I don't know if you have a local rule around that issue, but I'll give you a couple of suggested best practices. There's no one size fits all, but at CIRSA, our main suggestion is, you have the right as the board to manage the flow of your meeting. And let's be honest, if someone stands up during public comment is engaging in a personal attack on you, if you begin to try and match that tone for tone or provide them with a response, I assure you there's nothing you can say in the moment that's going to change their mind. Right, so you're probably better off just saying, all right, the mayor's at the beginning of public comment might make some cursory comments. This is our period for public comment. This is your chance to address the board with any concerns that you have on your mind. Please recognize that this is just to hear from our constituents regarding anything that's on your mind. We typically don't answer questions during public comment, right? We certainly can't take action on anything that comes up during public comment because it's not on our agenda. Right? And then you just let people get through their comments. If it really feels like it's something that requires a response, our suggestion at CIRSA is you wait till the end of the public comment period. And then as elected, you first ask yourself, is this really a question where I can unburden myself by asking the administrator or the clerk? Hey, that question that came up during public comment about, petitions to put something on the ballot. Clerk, can you remind us, and maybe it's something that staff can help you answer. Or it's a question about a project. Hey, Public Works Director, could you address, the concern that was expressed during public comment about when that street's going to reopen or whatever, and let them do that for you, right? Again, if it's a personal attack, I guess I'd suggest if you really feel like you need to respond, maybe at the end you just go on record saying, hey, I'd just like to address something that was stated earlier. I just want to go on record saying that I respectfully disagreed with some of the comments that were made about me during public comment. We're not going to get to the bottom of this, and public comment is not here. The purpose of this is not to adjudicate these concerns. I just want to make it clear that I feel like those were inappropriate comments and leave it at that, because you didn't have on your agenda, a mini trial about these kinds of things, right? So the mayor or the president, sometimes we can recalibrate if people are engaging. I know you have a little comment that says, please don't engage in personal attacks, right? We can recalibrate, and if that happens, maybe the mayor could say, we appreciate everyone speaking out and providing us with some reminder. Just a reminder is our meetings are not the appropriate place for personal attacks. But it's different than the liability issue, right? Because in the 10th Circuit here in Colorado, we have a case where the law in the 10th Circuit, there's knock on wood. I like it when they make law in New Mexico because I don't have to deal with it. Right? So in New Mexico, there was a governmental entity that passed a rule that said no personal attacks during public comment. And they removed someone from the room for engaging in a personal attack, okay? But they weren't engaging in criminal disorderly conduct or disruption of a lawful assembly, and they won their civil rights claim. 10th Circuit in Colorado, the 10th Circuit, which controls in Colorado, has said just a mere rule that prohibits personal attack is overbroad for First Amendment purposes. So all we do is pivot. We thank them for their comments and we move on. Yes.
We've had situations where the person at the podium is attacking people in the audience.
Yeah.
So do you have a recommendation how to diffuse that?
Well, we can ask them to direct their comments to us, right?
Well, no, they are commenting to us, but they're denigrating people in the audience.
Yeah. Well, look, if they defame that person and that other private party in the audience thinks they have a defamation claim, who's responsible for prosecuting that?
The person in the audience.
Them, not us.
But
You don't get conscripted into those things.
No,
Yeah.
but do we have a responsibility to let them continue speaking about the person? You know, it's their free speech to say what they want.
Yeah,
As an incoming mayor, would there be some way I could finesse it, maybe ask for
Maybe.
recess?
you could, but when you come back, to make sure you don't expose yourself to a claim by that person, if you recessed and they were only 1 minute in, you're gonna give them 2 minutes more when you come back from recess, right? So sometimes it's just, it may seem like a long 3 minutes, but you just left in 3 minutes. And a little bit of it might be psychology too, and I'm not a psychologist, but if it's a personality type where you can interject for a second, you think it might have an effect, say, hey, just a reminder, public comments or to speak to us as board, so I ask you to direct your comments to us. If they say it.
Well, they physically are talking to us about that
But
person.
they're saying
But you can also remind them they're being recorded and it's gonna be on YouTube forever and ever for the rest of their lives, for everybody around the world.
that's exactly what some people want.
Yes, exactly. That just.
Yeah, in this dynamic, in this day and age, right, there's so many dynamics going on, and there's no one size fits all, but one of the dynamics going on in public comments, sometimes in this day and age, people are showing up in public comment not to speak to you. They might be there to deliver a message to somebody here in the audience. They might be talking to somebody who's doing Facebook Live and you don't even know what's happening. They may be wanting to talk to a newspaper report, whatever it may be, right? So that's in terms of conservative risk management. You're going to have a 3-minute public comment period. I would just recognize it's sort of the rough and tumble. As you're going to hear things you don't like, you just let it go. In terms of managing the flow, even no matter how controversial the comments are, you just thank them and you call up the next person, right? And some things, tools that some of our members use is you ask people to sign up or have a card, and then you can manage that and you can say, okay, next speaker is Sam Light and on deck is Bill Jones. And so then the audience is creating this expectation that we're going to move sort of through a flow pretty quickly. I encourage you not to try and answer questions as they occur in the moment and not try to match people tone for tone and deal with questions, if at all, only at the end. And if it's the introductory comments, that helps lay the expectation that most 95% of people will understand, oh, I get it, it's just my chance to talk. They're not going to take action. We're not going to get them back and forth. Sometimes you can tell staff's taking notes. If there's something that requires follow-up, then staff may reach out, or staff is always available if you want to reach out to them about something that you've raised. All right, we do whole separate longer trainings on that stuff too. About at www.CIRSA.org, if you're really interested in the legal side of it, there's a presentation that I've got up there called The Law of Incivility. And you can look that up and see what the actual legal principles are around that issue. Okay. Last thing on transparency, I'm going to wrap up here pretty quickly. Who's active on social media? Anyone? Let me ask you this way. Does anyone use social media to do their job as a government official? Okay.
Certainly open.
Now, on the other hand, those people, if you have social media, personal social media, the people who knew how to find you on personal social media before you got elected, they still know how to find you on personal media. Right, do you have town-issued email addresses?
Yes.
Okay, so you have, just a reminder as a best practice, you have every right if you want to remind that person, hey, DMing me, direct
Direct message.
boy, this is embarrassing. Direct messaging me on my social media, right, is not where I interact with constituents about town business. If you'd like to reach out to me as a public official, email me at this email address, right? So, last thing about transparency, the statute says that a meeting for purposes of the openness requirement is any kind of meeting in person, by phone, or by electronic means, which is email. So take a look at the handout there. I've read about email suggestions for elected and appointed officials. So you don't want to use email as a substitute for public meeting deliberations, okay? Another good practice is in your emails, in terms of, irrespective of the meeting issue, emails of public officials, correspondence of elected officials by email, by and large is a public record, right? There are a couple of exceptions to that staff and the attorney will help you with if it ever comes up. But in terms of managing that risk, I encourage you to copy the administrator, or the administrator, and if it's a department head or something like that, you copy both of them. And then the record's in the system, and when we ever get a core public records request that says, I hereby request all emails of the public officials, the town board members regarding the subject, and staff more readily can take care of most of it. They'll still have to contact you for one final check. hey, we got all these emails. Do you have any other emails that you didn't copy staff on? Right? Because we have a legal obligation to provide those records if they're requested. All right, any questions around that stuff? Yes, sir.
So if you forward your town email to your personal account,
Yeah.
which is you put a Quora risk for your personal account.
The rules are content driven, so it doesn't matter what kind of device, who owns the device that it's put on. If the content relates to your duties or your job as a public official or concerns public funds, then it's subject to the open records law, irrespective of what device it's parked on. So if
The rest of the emails aren't town emails.
with respect
Are they at
to,
risk?
with respect to a Quora request, no. But your fiduciary obligation, your legal obligation is to make sure, right? That's why I say, make it easy on yourself by copying your staff. But if you don't, recognize you're still gonna have an obligation. And if you're a hoarder of emails, you're gonna have to go through all your emails to figure out if there's anything responsive that you need to provide to the clerk in order to respond to the request. Now, having said all that, also, you don't have to be a hoarder, but make sure you're following the retention schedule. Like routine transitory emails, do you follow the state model? If you follow the state model, just routine transitory emails, you don't have to keep for more than 30 days, right? But if you want to keep them all, go ahead. But just recognize if she gets a request for all of your email correspondence that relates to this topic, and you have things that are 2 years old, then you're going to have to forward them to the clerk so she can include it in the response. Now, last bit, access to the personal device. Sorry to be the grim reaper. In federal litigation, scorched earth federal litigation, the expectation of the courts is that if someone wants to take a swipe of someone else's hard drive to ensure that the discovery has been properly complied with, we're going to be obligated to do that. It's all about, in discovery in federal court, everybody knows what's on paper. It's all about what exists in the cloud. And those plaintiffs that have the resources and are so willing, they can readily get a court order that says they get a swipe of a phone or a personal hard drive. Doesn't mean they get to take that stuff and publish it. It's still under a protective order that can only be reviewed, and they can only access ultimately and keep relevant information. But they're still getting a swipe of your, drive or cell phone. So that's never going to happen here. I'll tell you this is why the litigators, that's what they deal with, okay? Is requests, right? And court orders that require that a complete, accurate, verified and certified scan of a hard drive be produced and turned over to the other party. That's just the world we live in.
So, not all the boards have town emails. The only board is the Board of Trustees, and the Planning Commission and the Zoning Board of Adjustment. They don't have email, the town given emails. So, for instance, I choose not to have the town using my personal email address because I think it could endanger my personal account.
Yeah.
And so, that's a decision. There are other ways of contacting people, correct? Or if someone sends you something by mistake, do I still fall under that? Or it's jeopardize my personal?
Yeah, ultimately on the extreme legal side, if it still exists on your computer and the request is related to you, then you still need to look for it and provide it. Some tools that I've seen is some officials, they'll create a free Gmail account, planningcommissioner@gmail.com, and use that one to keep their personal separate from their public official. I wouldn't say that the risk is so extreme. Most of the officials, aren't given, particularly among our smaller members, aren't assigned an address to the town system, but whatever best practice looks to you like,
So it's kind of a personal choice.
Well, I don't know. Maybe the town's got policies around that about how they want to be contacted. Yeah. But in terms of where you sit, I guess if you say, I don't want to use my personal email address, and our practice is to distribute packets electronically, then in terms of, performing your duties, maybe the easy solution is to create a Gmail account. You can use that for your town business purposes. Maybe the staff suggestion, you're the ones responsible for sending all the communications out of your thoughts. Let's see, I think we handled that. I wanted, last thing about executive sessions, I know for the new folks, you haven't been in one yet, and you may not use it that much, but on executive sessions, just recognize, right, that executive session laws, you can only use executive session for limited topics and only have to follow very specific procedures. So make sure you get together with staff and check all the boxes before you go into executive session. And from where you sit as the board, if that motion doesn't sound right, please, please, please slow it down. Did we check all the boxes before we go into executive session? Now, we did all that, and now we're in executive session. We recognize it's our responsibility to self-police. If we go into an executive session for the purpose of legal advice from the town attorney, that's it. That's the box. We can't, while we're in there, even if it seems convenient, we can't say, hey, well, while we're here, can we also get an update on that property purchase negotiation? You can't mix and match topics. And then the last thing is, particularly for matters subject to negotiation, you got to be on the same page about protecting confidential information. So I encourage you, like before you exit executive session, maybe it's the mayor who says, okay, of all the confidential information that's been discussed in this executive session, which information, if any, leaves the room and who's our spokesperson? And then as fiduciaries, we're legally obligated to honor that commitment to confidentiality as identified by the governing body. That's true even if we voted against going into executive session, and even if we can't stand the idea of the underlying transaction being discussed. We do not have the authority to individually, release confidential information. Okay? I know it can be tough sometimes, people standing at the door on your way out, what you talk about? No, just remind them, and you can even on the record, remind them, hey, we had an executive session for this purpose. Just want to assure everyone that our discussions were limited to that topic. And please know that, if that negotiation that we talked about in executive session, if our strategy ever gets traction, we will have an agenda item at a future meeting for which there will be an opportunity for public comment before we make any decisions. So we just, recognize we're holding this executive session in what we have determined to be the best interest of the town. Yes, sir.
Well, one of the more controversial things we enter into as a board is when we're evaluating the town administrator.
Right.
And so some of those conversations, like individual trustees will have done their own evaluation and then bring those into executive session to discuss. So that there has been consternation on the part of the public about whether that is conducting business in private and using the executive session as a shield for that. What's best practice in that area?
There's no one size fits all. And I don't know what your process looks like. Some of our members, for example, will have a public step. Ultimately, the relationship is between the board as the employer and the administrator as the employee. And that's where the relationship sits legally and by contract, right? If it's an action item, if your evaluation leads you to the point that you decide to change benefits or compensation, you have to do that in public, right? So you want to check with the town attorney for their thoughts on this issue. Some municipalities will adopt a process where there is a publicly adopted portion of the evaluation, right? Some don't have that. Whether it's legally obligated or not, I think is a question of some debate, right? But the relationship, I would ask folks, public entities, the administrator is in a more public role. So I think they recognize, and through their professional organizations like ICMA, they recognize that part of their job is taking suggestions and constructive criticism and even unconstructive criticism. Sometimes in a public venue, they get that. They know it's part of the work and tumble of the job sometimes, right? But you have every right under the statute to have an executive session for a personnel matter and have the discussion regarding the performance in executive session. It's just that action has to be taken in the open meeting. Thank you. Yeah. I didn't drill down on that because I don't know all of it. Ins and outs. Yeah.
There's a phrase in that executive session law about members of the public body. What is that?
Yeah, so it says you can have an executive session for personnel matter, but not if the person who's subject to the session has requested open discussion, right? And it also does not include discussion of a member of the body. The body, we mean local public body, whether it's the planning commission or the board of trustees. That amendment was put in there a long time ago. And when I was a municipal attorney, I read that amendment to statute and I said, oh, this is interesting. There's, because once in a while, you know, a governing body, maybe they feel like there's a concern about one of us, and maybe it'd be nice to have a little private conversation with that person. I used to call it the woodshed provision. You know, so if the governing body, we got a problem with one of our own, let's just be courteous and tactful and not ever dirty laundry in public, and so we can have an executive session to talk about one of our own. The statute was amended. There is no more woodshed provision.
But what is the definition of a member of the public body? It's very confusing.
Local public body. So for you all, it would be anybody who's on the board of trustees, anybody who's on the planning commission. When they say body, they're reaching back to an earlier phrase in the statute that says local public body. Local public body, for your purposes, just to keep it simple, includes the board of trustees, the planning commission, any member of a formally constituted body that has any role in this governmental decision-making process. So, does that answer your question?
So
I don't mind going down the rabbit hole a little bit here because I want to make it clear that you cannot have an executive session to work out your differences with each other if you're having personality conflicts.
So
I'll just make it simple if that's what's going on. Right?
So we have a tree board
Yeah.
and a zoning board of adjustment and a
Yeah.
planning and zoning. I think that's.
Yeah, that's just.
Yeah, so the same woodshed.
So those are members of the body, but
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, but they probably don't have executive sessions that often, but if the tree board for some reason was not getting along and one of the members was, Sam, the intemperate one, and they wanted to have an executive session and tell Sam how to behave, couldn't do it. But, yeah.
The trustees can't talk about those board individuals in an executive session. Right, okay, and that's as far as that definition extends.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there may be some other twists on that. Like you may have a situation where there's an allegation or complaint against someone. And you may need legal advice on that. You can have the executive session for legal advice to understand what your obligations and rights are and what you need to do as a governing body to address that issue, but you're not talking about the underlying issue. Right? That kind of thing. All right, that help? Okay. I think that's it on transparency. On the next slide is item number 4, commit to ethics. I know I'm running over time, so I'm going to try and move quickly. We do a separate training on ethics. I'm happy to come by and do ethics training at some point for you, but I just want to point out on this slide here that once you become an elected official, you're subject to Colorado's state standards of conduct for elected officials. Those standards may seem like they're in some faraway place and like they're written in legalese, right? Because they are. But you'll want to take the time to plow through those rules a couple of times so you get a good working familiarity with what's required so that you can spot and address ethics issues before they become a problem, right? You want to be able to deal with those proactively. One of the saddest things I deal with is when we have an allegation of an ethical violation and it's got traction to it because it's a reasonable allegation, and maybe there was a violation, and the response of the elected appointed official was, I didn't know. Now, once the bell rings, you can't unring it. So staff and town attorney, they can provide you with the statute, or they can provide you CML. We've got a nice little publication, Colorado gives you a good overview of what those rules are. So just make sure you get a good working familiarity with what the conflict of interest rule is. That's the most common one, right? There's a provision in the state statute that obviously says you can't disclose or use confidential information to further your own personal interest. And there's a gift rule, right? So in the gift rule is the simple one sentence takeaway is don't accept any gift, no matter what its value. If it's clear to a reasonable person the gift is being offered to influence your vote as a trustee or to try to get you to depart from your faithful and impartial duties as a trustee. Unless folks have questions about ethics, I'll just leave it at that. I did leave you a one-page handout that gives you, and I take full responsibility for it. It's 25 pages in the statute book, but that's my one-page attempt to get some of the key issues on your radar. Okay. Last thing on ethics is recognize this, fair or not, right? Sometimes in the world of ethics, perception is reality, and reality is perception. So just think about what that looks like to you. In my way of looking at this, I think actual conflict is one thing where you're going to have legal obligations If you have an actual conflict of interest, you must disclose, recuse, all that kind of stuff. But, there can be this perception. And the statute in its purpose statement says that sometimes appearances of impropriety, even if it's not an actual violation, can be just as damaging. So as you work through ethics issues, think about what that looks like to you. And then on the flip side of that coin is sometimes, who agrees with this notion, sometimes elected officials can be on the receiving end of sort of allegations of ethical impropriety that are way off the dartboard, right? Well, if you have a good working familiarity with what the code requires, then you're prepared to respond to that. And you can tell the person, I respectfully disagree. I understand what constitutes a conflict of interest, and I'm not obligated to recuse myself, right? But then sometimes there'll be situations where it's a little more nuanced. Maybe you're deciding a new liquor license and everybody in the room goes, wait, why is he sitting up there? Isn't he like best friends with the applicant? Isn't that a conflict? Right? Sometimes don't underestimate the value of a curative disclosure, I call it. Just saying on the record where you're coming from. It lets everybody know that you've thought about the issue. Say, hey, Mayor, before you open the hearing on the liquor application, I just want to make a comment for the record. I've been approached by a couple citizens who asked whether I had a conflict and ought to be recusing myself. I just want to let you know that I thought about this, looked at the rules, chatted with the town attorney. I do not have any financial interest in this matter. Yes, the applicant was my old roommate back in the day or so, but I want to let everyone know that I intend to make my decision on this application, the same as everybody else. You have to walk the walk, but I think people appreciate that. If we just let each other know where we're coming from, know what relationships are, it's a lot better than battling uphill later when some undisclosed relationship is found out and then people go, oh, now it's really concerning to me because it was never disclosed. Okay. All right, last thing I want to get on your radar, and there's one more handout about quasi-judicial decision-making. So as I mentioned at the outset, you as the board have this awesome power to make decisions affecting people's property rights. And we have a proud tradition in Colorado where we want that power, right? But that's an awesome power. The planning commission and the board, at the end of the day, only 7 members on the planning commission. Only 14 members, only 12 members, okay, of this community get to decide the question, for example, of whether or not someone gets to rezone their property, or gets to subdivide their property, or gets a liquor license or marijuana. That's an incredible power. But if we want to have that power, we need to make sure we're meeting our end of the bargain, right? That we're honoring those people's due process rights. We all know that, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, okay? And what it looks like at a local government level, you all intuitively know what it means, right? When we have one of these due process applications, we call them quasi-judicial applications. The process is different. We have a hearing in front of the commission of the board of trustees where we give additional notice. That explains the sign, and then why is there more signage out there? Because we're legally obligated by the Constitution to make sure everyone has proper notice. And we're obligated to have a hearing, like a mini trial in front of the commission or the board. And we're obligated to make the decision based on the evidence, the information that's presented at the hearing. And our decision must be based on existing legal standards, so that people going into the process know in advance what the standards are going to be for a yes or a no, right? And then that decision has to be made by a fair and impartial decision maker. All of you. That all sound like the things that judges do? Yes. So this is not freewheeling legislation. This is not for the faint of heart. But this part of the job is where we're basically sitting as judges in judgment of some request that affects somebody's constitutionally protected property rights. Okay? So we do separate trainings on this as well. I'm happy to come back and provide that presentation. On the last slide for the process, there's some links to some training materials. I just want to get on your radar a couple of things to think about. You can watch those webinars at the outcome. But a couple of things as you get prepared, for upcoming land use hearings and licensing hearings. Your obligation under the law is to wait, not get involved in that, because you're the decision maker, right? So you have to wait until it's at your public hearing, right? think about it in like a judge, if there's a trial tomorrow and you and I are in court with each other tomorrow, your expectation of the due process clause is that I'm not calling the judge the night before. You're gonna rule for me tomorrow, right? You have the same legal obligation. It seems a lot less formal, but it's the same obligation, right? That you need to stay neutral and detached, not get involved in all the buzz, because I know it's a lonely part of the job, right? Because you got a controversial decision coming up, controversial land use application. What's the citizen's inclination? Controversial land use matter coming up. I need to talk to my elected official and convince them why they ought to vote yes or no. And I want to do that before the hearing because I'm busy the night of the hearing. Right? And as a decision maker, you have to have the fortitude to say, I can't engage with you about that right now. It's not that I don't want to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you. But as the judge, I can't talk to you outside of the hearing. And you understand you're a citizen, right? If it were your application, would it seem fair to you if the decision makers were chatting about your application, out of your earshot, where you don't have a chance to hear what they're saying, you don't have a chance to respond? That's what the due process clause is all about. And make sure you remain neutral. I used to be a newspaper reporter, so and they're going to do it, until the end of time. They're going to call you up about the controversial land use application. They're going to say, what do you think of it? And that is not the time to say, even if on a policy level, you never liked marijuana establishments. Now that you're the decision maker, the judge on licensing applications, you're not going to say to the newspaper reporter, I will never vote in favor of a marijuana license in this town. Does that sound like a fair and impartial judge? No. Okay. Last thing, just to wrap up my comments here is, and this goes to the risk issue that we deal with at CIRSA. You hold your public hearing, you get staff report, applicant, public comment, and now we come to that kind of magical time where the presiding officer brings it back and says, all right, board, let's talk about how we're going to vote on this application. That's your deliberation. We at CIRSA, we always want you to have a deliberation on the record. Presiding officers, give every member of the body a chance to speak, whether they want to take it or not. And at that point in time, what we want you to do is pick up the decision-making criteria. They'll be in the staff report, and talk about the application with specific reference to the criteria. Maybe it's a request for a special review use, right? And we had a good hearing, and the mayor says, who wants to start? I said, Mayor, I'll start. I'm going to vote no because I don't like it. Well, not a great start, but we can get there just by using what I call Sam's rule of why. Another member of the body can just turn to Sam and say, well, why don't you like it? Okay. Well, I don't like it because the building's too tall. Oh, well, now we're getting somewhere, because maybe the whole issue in the hearing was whether or not they met the height requirement. Or maybe it's even fuzzier. Maybe it's a special review use. And you say, I don't like it because I don't think it fits in the neighborhood. Well, one of the criteria, legally defensible criteria for special review use is compatibility with the neighborhood. Sounds a little fuzzy, doesn't it? But you can get there. Right? When I say it doesn't fit, you just keep asking why. Why doesn't it fit? Well, because this application is for stucco and a flat roof, and our design criteria and our standards and the entire neighborhood is built up of different type of architecture, and our rules allow us to look at architecture. But we want you to have that discussion on the record. And a couple of good things going on there. People are getting an understanding of why they're going to vote the way they are. They're also learning and understanding that this is not a freewheeling, decision where we make it based on personal preferences or any other irrelevant standards. We're applying specific standards to the decision. Okay. Well, on that slide, there's a couple of links there for more on that issue, and I'm happy to do a future training on that if you would like. So, I know I've run over. I just want to wrap up with a couple of final comments. So I've been with CIRSA now about 5 years, and I've kind of learned the hard way a couple of times that who agrees with this notion? There's some things about risk management that we can't control, right? Like what the judges might do, what the legislatures might do, what public perceptions are, those kinds of things. But I think it's a wise body, right, that does attempt to, control those areas of risk management that it can control. And just a couple of final examples that I haven't mentioned earlier. Things like committing to a no surprises approach. Your meetings ought not to have gotcha moments. They certainly ought not to have staff bashing. We've talked about it during public comment, right? But even if we did have a concern about a personal issue, imagine how powerful it is in strengthening the organization. Even if you had a concern, somebody engages in an attack on a staff member, just to say, as your rules say, our meeting discussions are not the appropriate place for attacks on staff. And even if you had a concern, you would take that to the administrator. And how supportive that would be. It would show that united front. If you have concerns, it's still going to be addressed. Who agrees with this notion? Is incivility on the rise? I don't know. Sometimes the job, right, is going to require that we exercise civility even in the face of incivility. But you're up to the task. You're up to the task, right? There are legal principles around that, but if we commit always to civility and mutual respect, no matter how difficult the circumstances, people are going to see that. It's going to rub off. It's going to make you stronger, and it's going to, right, reduce the risk in the liability, right? And also, avoid high conflict. That's, that type of conflict where we've lost sight of what's really the underlying issue, and it kind of becomes us and them, or right and wrong, and we're speaking in absolutes. Take a more nuanced view of all the issues that come in front of you. Did you have a question?
Oh, I think, well, my question is, maybe this is something for us to discuss, like no surprises. I appreciate it, like Stefan has said to us, like, hey, we don't want to surprise him. We want, it's a lot to be there. Like that, we go to him ahead of time and say, hey, this is something that's concerning. And so are we comfortable as a board, and maybe for the new board, that this is something that we want to do? Just to always, like, we want to encourage. I don't want to limit debate, and I don't want to put him on the spot if I know that if I have this issue.
Yeah, you can certainly talk to the administrator about what sort of communication style you want around that issue. The way I look at the risk is I think it's always appropriate from an elected official's perspective to make that tactful call to the administrator if you have a question. But do, be supportive of if the administrator, if you get the packet, you've read the packet and you have a question, you want to call the administrator, be supportive if the response is, well, thank you for that question. We'll be prepared to address that at the board meeting, because they live by that credo. Is their job is to bring, the elected officials all up to the same level of information as contemporaneously as possible. So if they hear a question from one of you and they may be thinking, well, this is something that, I should be prepared to share with the entire board. So we'll be prepared. We'll be prepared to address that on Tuesday night, or they'll send out a supplemental bit of information to everyone. This other one here that I put, the second last bullet, who agrees with the notion that, sometimes it seems like a lot of what we hear about local government is the controversy or the criticism or the bad things that are being done. Social media is kind of great media for, criticizing. But I think at the top of the organizational chart, right, part of the role is touting your successes, the successes that you have as a board, that your staff has had on your behalf, that the organization has. I think that goes a long way to building faith and trust that government is getting good things done, right, on behalf of the community, right? And I think it does help calibrate attitudes around local government that even sometimes influence risk profiles in the types of claims and issues that we deal with. And then finally, in terms of wrapping things up, commit always to the service of the town as an entity, to your board or commission as an institution, and embracing those fiduciary stewardships, the we responsibilities, being on the governing body that will serve you well. So the last handout is one on quasi judicial. It gives you a snapshot of what that whole part of the job is about. I hope that's helpful. My apologies that I've run over time. I'm happy to take questions that I've run. We got another presenter.
One last question. Is it proper for an individual board member to contact, for example, you or your organization with an individual question, or is there best practices on that?
Some of our members may have their own internal rules. My rule, we have this thing called the liability hotline. where we're available to, prior to a loss, talk with the member about some issue. But that's not a substitute for talking with your own town attorney. So in terms of liability and risk issues, the two things that we prefer is that it be the town's designated CIRSA representative, which is usually the risk manager or the manager or someone at that level, contacts us and asking if CIRSA can chime in on something. Now, having said that, sometimes I do get calls from individual elected appointed officials, and if it's something where, I can support something that the town attorney's already said, I'll do that. On the other hand, if people are calling me looking for individual advice, that's not my role, and I'm not shy about telling folks that, if that's the situation. So I encourage you to go through your manager if you have a concern and say, if you as a, and the other thing is the surprises issue, I'll be very frank. I do not want, if somebody calls me on the liability hotline, my first thing is, if I sense this is a live one, I'm going to tell people right up front, I'm not going to respond to this request individually because I don't want my views being weaponized at some board meeting where I'm not present, period. And that's fair. I think that's fair that we all commit to that. So there is a resource, and I'm happy to help where I can, but to be sensitive to that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah. Great to see you all.
Thank you.
All right.
5 minute physical break.
Yes, I think that would be a great idea. Everybody else agree?
Yes.
You gotta do something.
Really good news. Sam's presentation covered a lot of what I covered. So I'm able to boil down my 160 some odd slides to 145. The good news is the slides aren't showing, so we're not gonna go through. I'm gonna kind of go through, introduce myself. First, I'm Dana from DOLA. Dana is the easy part of my name. The harder part is HLAVAC. Don't even try to pronounce it. Just remember, got your back, Levac. Dana Levac is my name. Worked for DOLA. And how many people were in the military at one point in their life? Remember when you got out of the military, you thought, oh, God, I don't have to deal with acronyms anymore. No, sorry. We have DOLA, DLG, CDO, CRO, Prop 123, acronyms just all over the place. So I want to basically give you a quick introduction to DOLA and who we are and what we do. DOLA is the Department of Local Affairs. I work within the Department of Local Affairs for the Division of Local Government. We also have the Community Development Office, Community Resiliency Office, the Division of Housing, so much stuff going on in DOLA. All total DOLAs, give or take several hundred employees. The Division of Local Government is about 80 employees. Within the Division of Local Government, there's the field team. The field team consists of 8 regional managers and 4 regional assistants. The regional managers each have a region of the state. I have the Northwest region of the state. Basically go from Wyoming all the way down to Lake City. From Utah over to, not Steamboat Springs, Glenwood Springs. That's my region. 7 counties, 24 municipalities, 104 special districts. They're all my clients. I think of them as clients. My job is to help each and every one of those jurisdictional clients engage in good governance and getting things done that they want to get done, as long as those things are consistent with good governance and serving the goodwill of the people. So that being said, one of the things I love about Peonia, I've been doing this for 2.5 years. It's my most intense jurisdiction. Because a lot has changed in a small period of time. Really. I mean, when I first started, oh my God, I'd watch a board meeting and I was like, no, this is one of those towns that shows up on YouTube. But it's changed. It's changed. You brought on some professional management. You run your meetings differently. Run them with respect. The be nice, be fair is one part of running those meetings. But really, calling each other Trustee Bruner, Mayor Bachman. You brought civility into the forum. You address each other by title. You address the citizens that come for public comment respectfully. The whole tenor of the meetings has really changed. And I like to think, when I talk to an elected board, to say, what do you think your primary job is? So I'm not going to call people who are already here because they knew. So Trustee-elect Bruner, my understanding is you've been on the board before. What do you think the job of the board is? And is it different now, your perspective, than it was when you served previously?
Well, that's a pretty deep question. Fundamentally, I don't think very much has changed in terms of the fiduciary obligation. Okay. There may be some statutes or ordinances that have changed, but help me out. If there's been big changes in the responsibility of trustee, I need to know.
Nope, but I simplified. Check. I thought it was Check. I love the name. That's me. I'll check with that. My 25th wedding anniversary, we did a check. River cruise that started in Vienna, ended up in Prague, and we stayed an extra 3 or 4 days. And finally, when I checked into the hotel, I learned how to pronounce my name. We Americanize it so people don't spit all over themselves. I don't rest you, Trustee-elect. What do you think the real job of the board is?
To consider in
make policy. Okay, I'll go with that. Mayor, different role, anything different, what you see the responsibility being?
In my role?
Yeah.
Or just as trustees in
board.
general, the board? In my role? I'm not sure what your question is.
Yeah.
Oh, as mayor, well, first of all, I'll be talking a lot less as a mayor.
Okay.
And my role is to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak as a trustee and to be sure that the agenda packets have the amount of information we need so that we can conduct our fiduciary duty to the town of Paonia citizens.
You're all right. And one thing you're gonna learn about me is I force you to talk. I like talking. It's gotta be interactive, right? All that fiduciary stuff and all the stuff Sam talked about and you talked about, regulations and everything else. If you're doing it right, your primary responsibility is to build trust. Build trust. Trust between the board and the staff, between the staff and the board, and between the staff and the board with the public. If you follow all those rules, the open meetings, your policies, your rules, the statutes, your codes, your ordinances, you will build trust. Trust builds civility. Right now, and then Sam touched on it, we are in such a period of incivility because nobody trusts anybody, right? And because we are one issue people. If you came to the board with one issue, and that's really why you're here, you gotta drop that. It's not gonna work. You're about the town. The town has so many issues, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Every town has issues. They're constantly evolving. But if you look at your fellow board members or the citizens or the staff based on one issue, you're going to miss the big picture, and you're not going to be able to build that trust. You know, on the national front, you know, people look at their views on things like abortion, student loans, Gaza, Hamas, Ukraine, Israel, and they have one thing they're looking at. And if somebody disagrees with them, that's the end of the relationship. They could agree with them on every other issue, but they get so focused on that one issue that the whole relationship breaks down. You can't do that as a board member. You're here for 2 or 4 years, correct? Make that relationship last. Make it successful. And that's what I try to do. So one thing I will always bring to every conversation is candor, honesty, and the truth. Sometimes that's ugly. Sometimes the truth is ugly. I'm going to go right back to some stuff. You know, the mayor had applied for a grant and it was pending. And in the meantime, they signed the contract. Guess what? I can't give you money if you've already signed a contract. That was tough to say. Sorry, you would have gotten this money, but now you can't. You had an audit that hadn't been filed. Way overdue. We gave you a grant, $1 million award. And then I couldn't give it to you because you didn't have your audit filed. That was a tough message to send. Now, I was able to salvage it. And today, I believe you got $1 million for your water tanks. That's cool stuff, right? One of the nice things is I get to help you get money. We give out somewhere around 125 million a year. Just on the western slope in my region, we've brought almost $35 million back to the western slope by working with client jurisdictions. It's really important, and I work very closely with Sam and with Stefan, was working very closely with Mayor Bachman as she was applying for those grants. And the thing that we do is to try to get in as early as possible on a project and help you shape that project in a way that when you do come to us for money, you're going to be successful. I like to think all my regional managers are equally adept at that, but we get a lot of money in the Northwest. we get a disproportionate share of money. We get almost a fifth out of the 8 regions. We get a little over 20% of all the money.
And that's because of Mr. Levesque.
Well, no, it's not. We have a lot more needs, honestly. We have a lot more poor rural communities that need infrastructure, wastewater, water, public facility help. And we're pretty aggressive in going out and getting it. So back to the DOLA. Let's see, we talked about that. We have a lot of different areas inside DLG. The state demographer works for DOLA. If you haven't been to the state demographer's website, you are missing out. I mean, it's just cool just to go. If you're any kind of a data geek or a nerd, I didn't mean to look at you. It's hard to do if you're a data geek or a nerd. It's a great place to go. You can filter all this demographic data by jurisdictions, by gender, race, age, you name it, in your town. So you can find stuff about your own town that you may not have even known. So it's a great resource.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
If you have a specific problem that you can't find on the demographer's website, you can call them up and say, what about this? And they will get the data for you.
Yep, it's awesome website. The state DPT, Department of something, total taxation. Joanne Fagan, she is the state expert, works for DOLA. We had the recent bill last year where there were setbacks and set-asides and residual and givebacks and all those questions. You can just call her up and say, what does that mean for my jurisdiction? She'll give you the answers if she's able. Sometimes legislation is a little convoluted. It takes a while to sort through it, but ultimately it will. Okay. If you haven't looked at the local government page, Division of Local Government, get on there. There's a thing called Local Government Information System. Every jurisdiction has to file election reports, budgets, audits, if they're a special district, their boundaries, the terms of their special district. There's so much information there. If you wanted to go and see what you think is a comparable town, what do you think is a comparable town to Plano?
We are without compare.
Let's just say
Cedar Ridge.
Let's say Cedar Ridge. And you say, I wonder how they do on their budget. You can go pull their budget. You can go look at it this year, 10 years. You can look at where they spend it. What are their line items? What are their special enterprise funds? Any kind of questions you may have that just come up, and you can compare yourself to other towns or big towns or a town that you've just heard does something different. You can pull out their budget and other information and look at it. It's a very useful tool. All right.
Archive audits as well.
Yes.
And what was what do you search for that, local government jurisdictions?
Get into DOLA.
On DOLA.
Into DOLA, look up Division of Local Government, and look for local government information and filing systems. That's what it's called. So money, back to money. It always comes back to money. You know, people seem to be happy to me. It's not because I'm good looking, I tell you that. But it's because they think I'm all about money. I'm not all about money. We give out a lot. We have energy impact funds. We now have more Housing Now funds. We now have Climate Resilience Challenge funds. We now have Main Street Live funds, all aimed at providing a funding stream to help communities do better. But way more than that is what I and our team offers. We'll come in and help with budget. We'll come in and help plan budgeting. We'll help come in and do capital plans. We'll help do facilitations. We'll help do strategic planning sessions. Secret, we do board trainings. And I love it. It's really to come out and help you be the best you can be. I know that's probably an overused phrase from back in the day, but
What kind of wording? Okay.
there's one that your town has to come in for that you need to keep a lookout for, and it's called a READY grant, Rural Economic Development Initiative. And it's basically if you have an idea that can enrich the economic development within your town, you come in and ask for small incentive grants. Right now, they're in the neighborhood of 50,000. Examples, we set up some incubators, helped towns set up business incubators. We did a fairly large project with the city of Gunnison, where we gave them about $200,000, and they formed a sub-grant committee where businesses could literally come apply to them for sub-grants if they could prove they were creating new jobs in the area. We expanded a taco shop, a barbecue sandwich shop, a pizza shop, a hair salon. And anybody ever heard of Concrete ID? There's a business in Gunnison that makes concrete sculptures, logs and rocks, and they use them on playgrounds, and they use them at entrances to communities, and they ship all over the world out of Gunnison. And if you drive down to Gunnison, as you get near the airport, go down towards the airport, just drive some of the side streets, and you'll see these sculptures. They're all over the place. They don't have any place to store them. They make them, they wrap them, they put them on the side until they can actually ship them out. And it's fascinating stuff. We helped them build an entirely new building and get another machine so they could hire an additional, I think, 13 people. And that $200,000 created, I think, 30 jobs, all with salaries in excess of $50,000. That's a good investment. Now, we don't give out $200,000 anymore, but you can get up to $50,000. So as you look at that as the board or as trustees and come up with ideas, just know that that money is available. That was the whole first series of slides done. We're going quick because Sam wants to go home. The normal board training is 2 hours. And I say it's 2 hours, usually lasts about 3. And I think I've done 1 or 2 here before. And they're fun. Get engaged and get people to talk. So let's see, you guys talk about the statutory. Look at if you haven't looked at your codes and ordinances, look, as Sam said, your role and the administrator's role clearly spelled out. It's a roadmap to success. Just follow that roadmap. He talked about you're the board of directors and the administrator is the CEO. Make sure you always keep that in mind. One thing I want to touch on is if you're new to the board, or even if you're not, don't reinvent the wheel. You're going to get information from staff on issues, but you may come up with issues like short-term rentals, homeless issues, migrant issues, and be like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do with this? You don't have to start from ground zero. Most other jurisdictions have already dealt with those issues in one way or another. Educate yourself, reach out. I think the town is a member of CML, so you have access to CML. 1 or 2, or at least 2 of you should be going to the CML conference every year, and you should be budgeting for that. There's also CML district meetings, there's listservs. Get on them. Inquire of your peers what happened if they encountered this problem. Talk to your neighboring towns, talk to Hotchkiss, talk to Cedar Edge, Delta, Carbondale. Carbondale is over in Garfield County, but they're going to have the migrant issue as an example. I'm heavily involved in that. It's coming. So talk to them. How did they deal with it, and what was successful and what wasn't? Sorry, this is so quick. I'm happy to come back another time. We can do the full 6 hours. So I do talk a little bit more about how to be a successful board. It's more than just the respect with each other and getting on board. One of the most difficult things is being in that minority, particularly if you came with the issue and that was kind of your platform issue, so to speak, and you're not successful. You've got to lose the individual dedication to that issue and jump on, and Sam covered it. It's the town position. And you don't say, this is what the town's doing, this is what those other idiots on the board decided to do. No, you're now one of those idiots. You're one of the group of 7 who said this is the direction the town is going to go. Buy into that, invest into it, and own it. And there are going to still be people that disagree with you and want to argue with you. Don't bring yourself down to it. Don't bring yourself down. It's the town's position. It's well thought out. It's what we're going to do. What can you do, Mr. Citizen, to help us reach our goals? Encourage those citizens to become part of the solution and not just the obstacle to what's going on. Sam touched on this about talking to staff. It seems like it's always a kind of a touchy situation, and there's going to be questions, so please ask. There's nothing that says you can't talk to a staff member. But as Sam said, be very cognizant of what that staff member is thinking when you talk to them. You see one of your public works folks filling a pothole in the street, and you go up to them and say, hey, how's it going? How's your wife? How's your kid? What are they thinking? Oh, thanks, trustee cares about me, right? You stop and see the same person, you say, oh, when do you think you're going to get over to 3rd Street and get the potholes over there? What are they thinking? They're thinking, I better get that done. And as Sam said, that may not be what the supervisor says, it may not be in the capital plan, but you've just impacted that staff member and created conflict. It may not be big conflict, but every conflict starts small. So be very, very careful. I think Sam said it really well. If you see an issue like that, you want to know when 3rd Street's going to get filled, go ask staff. And if you got a complaint, citizens are beating on you because something hasn't been done, don't go to staff and beat on them. Go to staff. It's his responsibility, and I know he's more than capable of handling it. You don't recognize that staff has a lot of constraints. They have resources, financial resources, staffing resources. Be patient. Be patient. And that's the one thing that Sam said that I think was really, really pertinent was make sure the expectations coming from the board are very clear. I can remember coming to some of those earlier meetings where the expectations weren't exactly clear. And the town administrator would come to the next meeting and say, well, I thought this is what you told me. 2 or 3 people said, well, that's not what we agreed on. And somebody else would say, well, yeah, that's what we said. You can't do that. By the same vein, sorry to jump around without the slides up there. When you're doing a quasi-judicial or even not a quasi-judicial, and there's a motion, make sure the motion is very, very clear. Do not do multiple issue motions. Okay, make a motion, make another motion. If there's going to be an amendment, do the amendment. Make it very, very clear what you're doing, because it makes Sam's job a whole lot easier when she's doing minutes. And also makes this Sam's job a whole lot easier when he's trying to.
That's why we engage as mayor, so you don't make motions.
It's a whole different world. Mayor, like, it's a whole different world. There. Just a tie.
She knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
No, now we get them in writing.
Yeah, we do.
It should be.
Suggested motions.
Suggested
Really
motions,
helpful.
which makes it so easy.
Excellent. That's, and if you're gonna make an amended motion, write it down yourself before you make the amendment, so you're clear and it's just not a rambling motion. I've seen that a lot too, so.
Sam on her toes.
I was gonna say, but you're guilty too, Dave, so.
So let me talk about both the impacts and symptoms of dysfunctionality and discord. And for those of you that were actively involved 2 to 3 years ago, you'll recognize some of these. You get a lack of productivity Things just don't get done. You come to a board meeting, somebody brings up the issue, there's a bunch of squabbling, nobody really can figure out what the motion is, and you table it for another meeting. That's not good governance. Good governance is making timely decisions when you're confident you have all the information. You like this one, you transfer the power to the mayor when there's a tie. So be careful with that. I would bet you anything that Mayor-elect Smith doesn't necessarily want to be the tie-breaking vote, because then it all falls on her. So better for to go 4-2 vote in her eyes at least. This is a big one, and I'm going to be frank. This was a big black eye to the town 2 years ago. There are financial consequences. People don't want to come work for you. They don't want to do business in your jurisdiction. You lost the creative grant because of dysfunction. People see it. When you want to hire a professional, whether it's an administrator, a clerk, a department head, the good ones, you don't want to hire the bad ones. The good ones get on YouTube and they look at your meetings. And if there's squabbling going on, they're like, oh, I don't need to get in that mess. So recognize that impact. And then businesses that are looking to come into your town are doing the same thing. So please recognize that. Get a good image of your town through what happens at your public meetings. Obviously, public embarrassment, loss of confidence, and lack of trust. And you drive away the best and the brightest. You know, a good town administrator who's in just a situation where nothing gets done, decisions can't be made, people are coming at him or her from every direction, they're going to move on. They're going to move on. So don't lose somebody because you're doing that. Trying to see how many more. All right, only 50 more. Good guidance. So some good basic rules for being a board member. Always assume good intentions. Always. Even if you've been proven wrong before. If a board member is just absolutely blindsided with something, talk to them about it one-on-one, not in the meeting. Talk to them after the meeting, talk to them, have a cup of coffee, do something else. And if you absolutely can't stand the person, just stay away. But when you're in a meeting, be respectful. So always have good or assume good intentions. Mayor-elect, listen more than you talk, but now you're obligated to do that. But it's a good rule for everybody. You know, don't interrupt somebody. It's real easy when somebody seems to be going on to say, oh, time out, and let me talk. They'll burn themselves out. They'll stop eventually. So listen more than you talk. Find common ground. There's always common ground. Pick an issue. You know, and not to be overly political, but, you know, take the abortion issue. How many people think it's okay to go out and cut the head off a newborn baby? Nobody. Nobody. And you can start walking back and you can find common ground to where you can all agree on an issue. And then just recognize there's some things you're just not going to agree on. Be okay with that. Be respectful and engaged with your posture. Do not be on your cell phone during board meetings. You know, there may be times, you know, your wife's pregnant, your granddaughter's, you know, having issues or something. Understandable. Excuse yourself. Don't be texting and sending messages in a board meeting. But watch your posture. You know, don't be like when somebody's talking. Watch your tone. It's so easy to be disrespectful just through your tone. And you were talking about how you deal with somebody who's just going on and on and on. And Sam said, thank you very much for your input. That's tough. You know, somebody comes in, you're now the mayor, and somebody's like, oh, you don't know what the hell you're doing. You're a crappy trustee and you're going to be a crappy mayor. Mr. So-and-so, thank you very much for your input. And call the next person. It's really all you can do. And who wins in that situation? You win. You have totally disarmed that person. They have no power whatsoever. If you do anything other than that, you are giving them the power. Body language, verbal communication we talked about. And remember, everything you say or do in a board meeting is recorded and preserved forever. And it's available on the internet. It's there for your children, your spouses, your grandchildren, future generations, applicants for jobs, current employees. Don't have open fights, don't have open discord. It's just bad. I'm going to stop for questions. It's a good time. Questions about anything. Oh, I didn't give you my whole background. So I was born in New York City, not New York City, New York, Long Island. I was raised in New York. I don't say I grew up in New York. I'm still waiting to grow up. I'll let you know when I do. I went to Syracuse University on an ROTC scholarship, came out, went to the military. I was a captain in the Army Corps of Engineers, and I blew stuff up. I'm disappointed I didn't bring my hearing aids because I do have some. From there, I ran a small company, grew it up, sold it off. We introduced credit cards to fast food, movie theaters, and grocery stores. I apologize. From there, I went and became a deputy district attorney in Colorado Springs. From there, I ran my own practice for a little while, then became the assistant district attorney down in Trinidad, Colorado. From there, I ran for election to be the district attorney and lost the primary. And I went to be the chief public defender in Mojave County, Arizona. I did that for 8 years, training attorneys and doing primarily first-degree murder cases, and then was promoted to deputy county manager because I had a knack for managing, doing projects and budgeting. From there, I became an interim finance director for Gila County, Arizona, and there a city manager in Oregon. From there, an interim budget manager for a city in Arizona. From there, the court administrator for Las Vegas, Nevada. From there, the development services administrator for Las Vegas, Nevada. From there to here. I can't hold a job. That's 45 years. That's 45 years of government experience. So it's not quite as bad as it sounds. I've been here for 25. So I know government, and I think the reason they hired me is I've done almost everything except for public health in government. So I'm not a stranger. I don't pretend to have all the answers. But if I don't have them, I'll find them and I'll get them for you. Any trustee can call me, but you need to know that unless you're calling me about your administrator, I'm going to let your administrator know you called me. So you might as well just ask him to call me, ask him the questions. Okay. Same thing basically that should happen if you talk to one of his staff members. They should be telling him that we talked. And if I give any one of you information, I'll make sure that he gives it to all the other, if appropriate. There are some odd circumstances, but for the most part, everybody gets the same information. So with that background, I'm out of breath. Questions? I'll go. See, you can do that in 30 minutes.
I got lots of questions.
Okay.
We'll limit it to a couple here though, but okay, so we've got a situation here where we've started having meetings that are called public hearings, but they're not based on any statute. And they're like informational for the public. And so that's very confusing to me. And I'm curious how that impacts the quasi judicial nature. How do you know when you're in a situation where you are at a statutory public hearing versus one of these informational public hearings? And as far as the quasi judicial stuff goes, like are board members that aren't statutorily assigned to like the P&Z permitted to go to P&Z meetings? Is that a violation of the quasi judicial? How about watching them on YouTube?
What I would say, and Sam may override me, not good practice to go to the P&Z if you're not on the P&Z. Everything that happens at P&Z should ultimately come in front of the board. Should. So to ensure that you get the same information as all the other board members, let it come to you organically. Okay. In terms of whether it is a quasi judicial or not a quasi judicial, if it's a hearing that's required as part of an ultimate quasi judicial decision, then it's quasi judicial. So a lot of times you hear court hearings where there's not a decision being made, but they're hearing evidence, they're gathering information for a decision that's going to be made. That needs to be treated like a quasi judicial hearing.
Yeah, I agree. Like for statutory towns, there's a statute about how the planning commission is constituted. And I don't know if you have ex officio members, but if you're not ex officio, then I always encourage folks that, the planning commission is there to do the heavy lift. They usually have the longer hearings. They're working towards preparing a recommendation to the board. So support that structure by giving them the space, right, to do their job, recognizing that as a board, their recommendation will come to you. But I think if you're not the ex officio members, I would encourage you not to attend the planning commission. Now, the flip side of that coin is many times I've had the discussion about, well, how is the recommendation or the input of the planning commission transferred to the board? Right? Did we get a resolution that has a recommendation? Did we get a copy of their minutes? Are we supposed to listen to? Those are all things to work out with your staff and decide for yourselves as a governing body what information from the planning commission gets transferred over. And then if you are one of the ex officio members, recognize that you're a member of the planning commission. And so you have to, if you heard as an ex officio member of the planning commission something that's influential to your decision as a board member, you need to make sure that that gets shared, right? But try to find ways to have staff do that on your behalf of the planning commission, right? So that you're not individually being perceived or forced to carry the whole lift on behalf of the planning commission, right? Maybe the planning director does that for you. The planning director, like if a board member says, I'd like to learn more about why the planning commission thought this way about that issue. Let your staff do that for you. Instead of saying, well, I'm the ex officio member, let me tell you what we all did at planning commission, right? Because you're still in the game as a decision maker at the board level. I would encourage you to let staff support you in that regard.
Significantly different size jurisdiction, but as a development service administrator in Las Vegas, that's how we did it. Staff took the notes, staff prepared the minutes, provided the staff report on all opinions and issues.
So how about staff organizes a public hearing that's not required by statute and board members attend, and then that does go to the board as a quasi judicial matter? It seems like a very confusing situation.
So I
should be avoided, I think.
Yeah, and I hate to use this line, but like Pam says, sometimes there are questions you consult your town attorney on because they're so specific to what the town is doing.
Yeah,
it's not a simple rule.
Okay. Trustee-elect Bruner might be talking about some of the confusion that's happening in the community in that we're in the process of almost adopting regulations about short-term rentals, ADUs, and trying to get our general plan across the finish line. So all those are like these public meetings that are happening. I don't know if that's what you're referring to. Some of those.
Well, I'm curious about those.
Yeah. So just to put it in context.
Yeah, those are just community outreach, community engagements, getting community input on a plan that staff will ultimately bring forward to the board.
So it's been posted that board members may show up at those things.
Yeah, those are noticed meetings.
Yeah, those are legislative activities, right? Just in very general terms, the development of the policy, when there's no particular applicant in front of you, that's legislative. The point in time when you switch and you start taking that policy and those general rules and applying them to someone who's in front of you, that's going to be, in general, a quasi-judicial proceeding. So you may be working on your development standards and talking about height limits, setbacks, lot sizes, but the exercise of putting those general rules in the code is legislative. When the person comes in with a subdivision and then you're looking at their application in view of lot sizes, now that's quasi-judicial. What you want to do in terms of making sure we honor people's process rights is when you're having that legislative discussion, keep it at that high level. even though this is true in big cities or small towns, if there's only so much going on, or we all know things that may be happening in the future, we sometimes are tempted when we work on the legislative rules to start talking about this property or that property, right? But we want to keep it as a generalized policymaking discussion. That time will come later. Risk I deal with is during a legislative process, it gets so granular that someone who's a quasi-judicial applicant, it dusts off this evidence from way back when during the legislative. Say, well, these people have already talked about my property and what I can do with my property back when they were working on the general ordinances. So they've all got preconceived notions and bias about what they want to do with my quasi-judicial decision. That's why I suggest keeping it at that legislative level.
Okay.
Other questions, and you can ask more if you like, not prohibited.
I get somebody else.
James, you want? Nobody else just wants to go home. Trustee Young, I want to get something to eat. No other questions?
Actually, I have a question, and that's texting. Does that fall into the same level as email?
Yes.
That you can text between just one other trustee, but have Cora's gone down to the texts being submitted?
Any communication.
How have texts been provided? That's my question. I don't know anything about it.
I don't know the technical side of it, but I have to go, I think, to the service.
For purposes of the meeting rule, it's any kind of meeting that's convened electronically. So I think a text message of 3 or more people are simultaneously texting each other, that could be a meeting.
Right.
But in terms of the public record, a public record includes a record in written or digital form. So we have plenty of claims experience with people, both in litigation and in helping members with Cora responses of requests for text messages.
You just have to go to your Verizon or whoever, maybe.
Well, the way the clerks deal with it is if there's a text message from the mayor to trustee Sam that was talking about the budget amendment, and we have a Cora requester, we ask that the mayor or trustee Sam take a screenshot of it, forward that JPEG to the clerk, so the clerk can print it, scan it, and put it in the record set.
Thanks.
Yep.
What happens when you're-
From our perspective, here's where it's the road. In litigation, we never want to be surprised with a record that it can be data mined later that we didn't know existed, that we didn't sooner know existed. So yeah, we're learning the hard way lessons that we learned with email. I mean, back when email started in 1996, there was some misperception that it was like a private company. Same thing's happening with texting, and ask the state legislature, they'll tell you that the same principle doesn't exist with disappearing messaging.
And the big thing, and Sam touched on this, is an aggressive litigant is going to get your device, and they're going to be able to scan that. They may not directly get the information. It may go to a judge to screen in camera review.
Yeah, mostly I just wondered what the clerk's gonna do if, what Sam would do if she got a Cora and I had texted with Stefan.
You can call the Clerks Association.
So you have, mostly I wonder about the physicality of it.
Yeah, use these screenshots.
Just, you do screenshots of that? Thank you.
Yeah, we have a lot of our larger members are just getting inundated with electronic Cora requests. They have serial. By the way, there's some legislation that was trying to get at the question of serial abuse of Cora. But a lot of these are targeted at email and electronic communication of elected officials. And so they put systems in place just to get screen grabs of the text. Yeah, and of course, that gives practical risk management. If you don't like the notion of having to do that, then the best text that was sent was the one that was never sent, right?
So what is the poor mayor supposed to do when everybody calls her about some hot issue? To avoid the serial meeting aspect.
Oh.
That's
Oh,
never,
you
at
mean-
least that
no.
didn't happen to me in 4 years. That never happened to me.
Shouldn't have.
So, well, let's see, because Bill brings up, no one else knows that I've been called. But I would know if Trustee Valentine and Trustee Schwartz both called me, and it turns out that I'd already talked to John about the topic, Kathy calls me and she starts bringing up that topic, I'm assuming I would have to say, I can't talk to you about this because it's already been brought up to me by another trustee and I shouldn't be talking about it. Would that be appropriate? Because they don't know it's somebody else.
Safe than sorry.
What's that?
You're better safe than sorry.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would do, but I'm not saying that the person that called me is at fault because they don't know somebody else called me. It would be incumbent on me to stop it right then and there and say,
Yeah, and I
I
think,
talked about this with one trustee, I can't.
yeah, and I think best practice as mayor would be to agendize the item for discussion.
Yeah, no, exactly, but I wouldn't continue the conversation. I'd probably say, let me talk to Stefan. Let me call Stefan. I can't talk to you about it. We'll go from there. Is that did you ever have
No, that never
two
happened to
trustees?
me.
No.
I find the best practice is we all have a town email. And the best practice is to include the town administrator and the mayor if you decide, or let the town administrator decide whether this needs to go. And use the town email as your only form of communication because it automatically saves everything. And then we don't have this problem with you're going to lose your phone for 6 months or 6 weeks. That could be a real problem. And the easiest thing is we have this system, use the system. Stay away from texting. Phone calls are okay, but use them very judiciously.
Yeah, a good crutch is a response to the original email saying, I have forwarded your inquiry to town administrator.
Right.
And copy them.
Yes.
One thing that was really nice, I've seen some trustees come in and take office, because I've served with 11 trustees now in 6 years, that they've used their own personal computers and they have their town emails going back and forth. And one thing I really appreciated about coming on the board was I was given an iPad. It was like very disciplined. Only stuff on the iPad. Everything I dealt with town business for 6 years is all sitting on an iPad. Absolutely nothing on my iMac at home. So it was a piece of cake. It was a real nice, clean break.
I have to say, I use my computer and I have a separate hard drive, separate file system because I don't like iPads. I cannot type on them. You can't do anything with them. They're just a glorified keyboard. So I have tried to keep it separate just because I can't use them.
And what I did is I took everything, so I had a file, it's called Town of Paonia. Everything in that file, I copied onto a thumb drive and gave it to Stefan. So my entire 6 years on the board is now in Stefan's property.
But it does open up our whole computer to being looked at, which I understand, I don't have anything on there. I wouldn't care if anybody else saw it. I just.
I don't have to get my computer
Right.
on the core request.
Exactly.
That's the thing that's nice.
Yeah, and I just like to go to I like my desktop, use it. And it's just easier for me. So I'm trying to, and then the email that's all I use is the town email. So hopefully that doesn't come back to bite me. I may lose my laptop for a while if there's a Quora, but I have a backup
It takes a
system.
little more than a Quora.
Yeah, to have to grab my laptop. Yeah.
Doesn't like a face of paper.
If you're using the town email, another nice thing that helps lessen the burden on you is we get these large call requests and the IT folks will identify search terms. And it enables them to grab, 95 to 99% of the responsive materials fairly quickly. Right. And so being within that system is.
Yeah, only that, yeah. So, Sam, do you have laptop? So with Dave coming off the board, will his laptop be available for incoming trustees? iPad?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Are you the only one using a town iPad?
I do as well.
Honestly, I think that's a conversation that you should probably have with Stefan, because I don't know that if we have a policy for that or if it needs to be instituted. I remember they started doing that when I was elected to the board. But I hadn't seen it happen most recently, except for using old ones. So it might be something that you might want to put up for discussion and decide how you want to deal with that.
Okay, because there's 2 in use, 2 town iPads, right? Okay. Thank
And
you.
we have some town computers that other people use, because when it was first put out for the poll, they were asked, do you want an iPad or a computer?
Oh.
Some people opted for computers. And I have a computer I'm going to donate to the town that I was using as my town computer.
Oh, I might have taken up on a computer.
So let me make a comment on emails. Never put anything in an email you don't want on the front page of the paper.
Yeah.
I can tell you from personal experience, not my email, but as court administrator, a request came in for emails between two judges. And there were some very embarrassing emails that could not be protected under any exemption to public records. It came out. It wasn't pleasant. Other questions? Okay. Thanks. Sam got one.
If I didn't want to jump in on your guys' training, but it kind of goes back to when you were talking earlier about public comment. One of the hot topics amongst clerks, as I'm sure you guys know, is there's been issues with a lot of jurisdictions across the country that do Zoom and allow commenting on Zoom, and that being hijacked by people where there it's hate speech, racial slurs, this, that, and the other thing. A lot of places don't even allow that anymore or have things in there. When is it okay to shut that down? I mean, if me and Ruben are sitting over here and someone's just going on a crazy hate-filled diatribe, like in those circumstances, when's it okay for us to forcibly mute it?
Yeah, I
Okay, can I have the legal answer?
Yeah, you may, if you have no rules, you may have to suffer through it once, but things that I see others members doing, is some of them are discontinuing public comment by Zoom, ones that are doing hybrid meetings. Some of them are significantly limiting the length of time. It's actually reported appellate decision out of Colorado that upholds a 90-second comment period. So some people are chopping the public comment periods in half, or eliminating them altogether. And people say, well, wait a second. That's a violation of my First Amendment right to not have a public comment period. The constitutional analysis is as long as you're providing alternative means, right, of allowing people to access their government officials, so that's pretty extreme, but you probably read about Wheat Ridge got hijacked. Yeah, they ended up just pulling the plug. But you're not in the middle of any one speaker, but they just discontinued and they said, hey, if anybody else wants to speak, we have future opportunities for in-person public comment.
So what you're telling me is I should talk to our mayor about putting that on the agenda so they can make a policy about it?
Yeah. And as was said,
We don't want to wait.
Yeah, you may have your own way of looking at what I really want to have, but there are plenty of people who look at this wheel, and so there are good resources and people who have been through it and have thought about how to deal with this. Some other members they have gatekeeping mechanisms. And it's, again, not to censor their speech, but just a simple gatekeeping mechanism of having to sign up with the clerk in advance in order to be admitted to speak. A lot of people don't want to go through that hassle. So the real bad actors just say, oh, I'll move on to some other jurisdiction where I can, anonymously Zoom bomb at the last minute, right, without having any gatekeeping mechanism. So some of our members, in order to speak during public comment period, have to click on a link, give the clerk and get put in the queue.
Thank you.
Any questions as a result of that? Thank you very much. There is much more in depth if you want me back.
We'll have you back again, I promise.
And just one last thing that Sam, I was wondering if any incoming or current trustees need a tutorial on the Town of Paonia website to find the code, to find the Muni docs, to find.
I'm planning on putting one I'm creating a quick reference guide folder for all of you guys with a lot of stuff, and there's gonna be a page in there about how to find DOLA resources. I talked about CIRSA and CML, so. Yep, and the town website, just right in this.
Thank you,
Thank
Mayor.
you.
Thank you, Sharon.